One day, humanity was covered by a great curse, the so-called tower. This tower was famous for having a gate from which terrifying monsters emerged. Of course, the world has changed so much that resistance to these creatures has appeared. People who called themselves players became the only hope for humanity. If they were chosen, they immediately had status, fame, and wealth. But our hero was never able to become a player. Carl was an ordinary worker who received pennies. There was always a hope in his heart to become a hero. There was a guy his age who was the envy of everyone. He was the possessor of unique abilities. Because of his incredible power, people called him a cheater. In turn, Carl always returned home closer to night. Every day he checked his mailbox in the hope of receiving the treasured letter. But he could only see the loan, the payment for treatment, etc. Carl had a sister, Mary, who was usually already asleep by this time. They also had a mother who was very sick. That day was Carl's birthday, and his sister congratulated him. The guy couldn't understand where she got the money for the cake because they were barely making ends meet. But Mary said that she also had money. Even so, Carl could see that she was lying because her shabby clothes said otherwise. Still, he was incredibly happy about it because his sister had not forgotten about him. But the main gift was not the cake, but a letter, especially for him. Only after opening the letter did the guy notice that it was an invitation from a player. Carl's happiness knew no bounds. So much so that he even forgot about his mother's sleep. Although he couldn't believe that this was all not a dream, one thing was true. He understood that this would help him change their lives and save his mother. The very next day, he went to the Players Association. A friendly girl met him in the building and told him about all the intricacies of the system. Only after saying the right phrase did information about Carl appear. The guy suddenly asked what the question marks next to the line, unique abilities, meant. It turned out that these very questions mean that he has unique abilities. Their celebrations were so loud that one guy heard their conversation. It was that same cheater who wanted to talk to Carl. Although the girl couldn't do that, she couldn't resist Gary and let them go. After some time, the guys stood in front of the portal. The first thing Gary did was suggest going inside. The first thing that surprised them was the number of monsters on the first floor. This was a very big problem for our hero. But Gary was famous for his strength for a reason, because he immediately went into battle. This task can be completed in different amounts of time, but an hour to clear was considered a high rank. But the owner of unique abilities was not an ordinary person. These guys, to prove their strength, must complete it in 10 minutes. Gary cleared the entire floor in literally 47 seconds, which was a record. Those with unique abilities could surpass all ordinary players in a few months. Gary had a plan that he had been working towards for years. He wanted to create the most powerful guild to surpass everyone on this planet. That's why he wanted to recruit Carl to his side, but he was too weak. Gary temporarily helped our hero with training, and on that very day his first battle with a goblin took place. But we quickly moved forward to 5 years later, where the tests were still being conducted. Actually, our hero was on this floor fighting monsters. Many people watched him and did not understand what he was trying to achieve. But the guy had only one goal, which he worked hard towards. And yet, every time he opened the information window, he despaired. The problem was that after 5 years, he was still level 1. In contrast to him, there were guys who fought no worse than Carl. A group of people cleared out goblins and raised their level. The next day, they were supposed to go to the second floor. As soon as the guide left, the boys began to whisper about him. This guy was known among many, and there were various rumors. At the very least, many have heard that he has unique abilities, but they decided that if this were true, he would hardly be with them. So Steve said the more appropriate truth. Of all the players, he is the first one down. The guys couldn't believe it because it sounded wild. As it turned out, that guy wasn't even a ranker. Carl had one nickname, the player who can't level up. During all 5 years of being on the first level, the guy was able to find a secret place. It was in this place that one goblin appeared on which Carl wanted to practice. As Carl approached him from behind, he knew this would not be an easy hunt. But he couldn't even get there calmly because he stepped on a branch. The goblin reacted instantly and attacked the impudent player. A truly fierce battle against the monster began. Our hero felt that the pressure from the goblin was great. It still took him an hour to destroy one goblin. The funniest thing is that his battles didn't even pay off in resources and he was on the verge of going into the red. Walking down the corridor, the guy met an acquaintance, Theon. Our hero wanted to talk to him, but he just walked past and apologized. Not understanding what was happening, Carl still went to the manager. The guy immediately asked Davis what was wrong with Theon, but he started acting strangely. Soon our hero was notified that his squad would take over Theon from tomorrow. Carl didn't understand what had happened, but the manager assumed they had heard rumors. With a heavy sigh, the guy decided that in any case it was all true. Nothing could be done. At that moment, the TV started talking about the Angela Guild. This is the very guild that Gary wanted to surpass. They had to clear a floor that no one had ever entered before. Our hero listened to all the news about players who opened various gates and reached huge levels. The guy understood that he was also a player, but this whole world was too far from him. Soon he couldn't resist and simply turned off the TV so as not to listen to the news. Anyway, he thanked Carl for his work and gave him his pay for the day. And also, he asked not to be offended by Theon because he felt guilty before Carl. Our hero understood that it was not his fault and there was no need to apologize for it. The manager thanked for understanding and also said that he had received one request in return. Carl asked in surprise what they were talking about. The very next day, he met a guy named Zane, for whom he was a guide. It turns out that this guy is the cousin of that cheater, Gary. He immediately began introducing all the team members, Peter, Marvin, and also Emma. These guys had to go through the training floor in 5 days. Carl was confident in everyone, so he decided to get straight to the point while already on the road. Towards evening, the guys discussed everything that was required and set up camp. But if the camp is ready, then dinner should also be ready. Peter and Marvin were doing it when they suddenly asked the guide a pointed question about the level. Carl smiled calmly and confirmed that it was true. Soon, the boys decided to discuss their hunt for a bowl of soup today. In any case, all this was just training before their battles. Carl assured them that they would level up unless they met the keeper. The Guardian is the huge boss of each floor and is hunted by large teams. Of course, you could get a lot of experience and cool items, but the boss himself was very dangerous. However, there was no need to worry because there are special guilds that hunt them. The action moves to the 4th floor of the tower. A huge monster ran in an unknown direction. He eventually tripped and fell, which was a fatal mistake. A moment later, the stronger ogre simply absorbed him and became even stronger. All these days and battles with monsters Zane described in his diary. Every day they were met with crowds of goblins and orcs, but they moved forward through the floors. Guide Carl was cunning and led the orcs against each other. In this way, students could easily and safely improve their level. Zane was absolutely sure that one day he would become a high ranker and write an autobiography. At that moment, the guys only had to get through the 5th floor. Emma was looking forward to the class she would get, just like everyone else. But our hero looked at the moon, realizing that a difficult test awaited them. The 5th floor was no different from the 4th. The goblins here were a little stronger. Each of Carl's students got rid of the creatures with ease. In turn, the guy stood to the side and watched the students, but his attention was drawn to the wind and dust, which was not a good sign. He denied that it could be the keeper, but still ordered them to run for cover. At that moment, Carl ran and took all the backpacks, thinking about one truth: training. All this was not a game, but a real struggle for life. Because of his clumsiness, Peter got into trouble, and Zane ran screaming for help. In the tower, any carelessness could cost you your life, especially if you were without a team. While Peter was rescued, an attack occurred on Emma, who was still injured. Our hero tensed up at this moment, realizing that things were bad for them. But the approaching storm, which was getting bigger and closer, added fuel to the fire. Carl began to pray, hoping that it was not what he thought it was. However, a moment later he appeared, the huge leader of all the goblins. This was the floor guardian, which meant we had to run as quickly as possible. At the same second, Carl threw a smoke bomb, and all the monsters disappeared into space. Our heroes at this point could have taken advantage of the opportunity and escaped from the battlefield. Of course, they didn't know where to go, but luckily for them, they were with an expert in the entry levels. Carl soon led them to a cave where they could catch their breath. As soon as the opportunity arose, the boys asked in bewilderment what it was. Of course, our hero told everything as it was and said that they should wait it all out. Pointing to the bags, he suggested that they had enough supplies to wait for help. But on top of everything else, they had problems, because Emma did not come to her senses. The girl was seriously injured and poisoned with goblin venom. Our hero replied that these were all minor details because they had an antidote. To his horror, Carl discovered that this was precisely the medicine that was missing from the bags. Most likely, he simply dropped it while they were running away. The guy started to panic because he couldn't have made such an elementary mistake. And yet, since he was responsible for everyone, he decided to go for help. Naturally, the students were in shock and asked the guide to stay because it was too dangerous. But our hero asked them not to worry, because he knows this floor like the back of his hand. Outside, he realized that he had lied a little to his students. Because of the floor guardian, the monster's behavior was now unknown. With a heavy sigh, he decided to take a different route. He had to get to the hill, fire the flash, and quickly return to the students. The boy hoped that he would not meet the keeper, but his thoughts got ahead of him. The huge giant hit Carl with all his might and sent him flying. Naturally, things were bad, which meant that the smokescreen was used again. Soon after, he stood up and fired a flare pistol. Now it was necessary to run as far and as much as possible. In just a couple of seconds, he came across the door to the 5th floor. The guy would have liked to go there, but he just couldn't because of his family. He understood that with his level, only certain death awaited him there. Only from behind a huge monster was moving at incredible speed. Now he had a choice, to meet his death here or to try to get to the 5th floor. Once he started to open the door, he had no other way back. A moment later, the system allowed Carl onto the floor. The most amazing thing was that the floor level was lowered for him, and he had to hunt a goat. The guy didn't understand what kind of nonsense this was, but he killed the goat and the floor was cleared. Our hero knew for sure that this was some kind of joke, because something like this couldn't happen on the 5th floor. Once again, Carl's thoughts became a bad joke for him, as darkness enveloped him. Soon he found himself in an unknown dark space. An unknown voice spoke to him, assuming that it was his new master. The next thing the voice asked was to say its name and establish contact with it. Suddenly, the system issued an ego requesting access to Carl's body. It seemed like it was all a dream, and a moment later the guy began to open his eyes. As soon as the guy came to his senses, his relatives immediately ran to him. It turned out that he had been missing for 2 weeks and was found unconscious. Davis immediately told everything that happened. The guild came at the flash of light, but the keeper managed to escape. Also, fortunately, all of Carl's students survived and came to visit him. Soon, the boy began to recover. It is surprising that his mother, being very ill, was more worried about him than about herself. And yet he assured her that everything was fine and there were no problems with money. Finally, he asked his sister to stay at home and look after their mother. For some time he thought about what had happened on the 5th floor. He was sure he would die, but he passed this floor, although his level was the same. However, now, after what happened, something has changed. The training floors were still filled with newbies who were raising their levels. But when one guy walked inside, everyone said his name. Of course, there were rumors about him that the guy just couldn't raise his level. But for the time being, another reason for its popularity appeared. Our hero was nicknamed in general circles as the Tutorial Destroyer. Using the ring on his hand, the boy released dark energy. In a moment, it took the form of a sword and it was ready to crush everyone in its path. Literally like lightning, he rushed past all the monsters and destroyed them in milliseconds. Now the crowds of goblins were no longer scary for Carl. The funny thing is that by that time he had not yet gotten around to choosing a name for his new friend. Right during the battle, while destroying goblins, he came up with a name and decided to call it. Now the ego was called Lu, which the sword even liked. The most surprising thing about this was that Carl's level did not increase. At this time, Lu's level was increasing, and he was already at level 7. At this rate, the guy began to farm all these crystals from the level. But how did he come to this power? A month ago, our hero explored the first floors. At the same time, he looked at the system, which said that his partner was the ego. These were the first changes in the system in 5 years. The guy assumed that he needed to establish a connection with his new friend. At that very moment, he screamed like a madman. Even the parrot decided to fly away from such shame. And yet, there was still a need to find a way to summon this something. The guy didn't understand how and what to do, but he gave him the name Lu. As soon as our hero uttered the partner's name, Lu's disembodied ego was summoned. So far, this entity has no form, and since the host is weak, the form will be chosen randomly. However, materials were required to create the form, as the system said. Literally at the same moment, the sphere began to suck in everything in the area. Thus, all the crystals flew straight to Lu. Moreover, Carl was even left without clothes, and at the end, he fought for the last pair of underpants. A few moments later, it was all over. Our hero was still able to win back his underpants. Only the next stage was the release of ego energy. In just a couple of seconds, a luxurious demonic sword was hanging in the air. Having picked up at least some kind of cape, Carl began to talk to him. Their acquaintance did not go very smoothly because Lu responded rather sarcastically. The guy understood that this entity had a bad character, which meant he had to be patient. Carl soon assumed that Lu was a soul, but he began to curse at his master. Based on the conversation, our hero realized that Lu belongs only to him and he cannot leave him. One way or another, if Carl dies, then the ego dies too, which means they will have to become friends. Finally, our hero asked if Lu felt pain. The entity responded in surprise that he was excellent and had emotions, and even feelings. Literally just having turned on Lu's feelings, our hero decided to teach him a lesson and threw a stone. Thus, the boys became friends, and now together they cut up all the orcs that were in their way. Lu's ability was to absorb the opponent's blood and absorb all experience. With each battle, the ego became stronger, which cannot be said about the owner. And yet, Lu told the owner that he had an incredible aura. In any case, the hunt was over for today, because the backpack was already falling apart from the crystals. The guy decided to go not to the tower, but beyond the gates the next day. Having mentioned this thought to Davis, he, perplexed, forbade him to go there. The man explained that people who thought they were going to the F-rank gate were dying there. However, these gates were different and had glitches. They were much more powerful. This has never happened before and only started a month ago. By the way, at the same time Carl met Lu, but he decided that it was a coincidence. Davis knew the guy had new stuff, but even with it, it was still very dangerous in that gate. He soon advised the tutorial killer to go home and rest. The reason Carl wanted to go beyond the gate was because of the huge amount of crystals. The guy understood that Davis cared about him, but there was no other choice because the loan was not lost. He started looking for a team, assuming that all this was a horror story for weak players. The very next day, Carl met with the team leader and they got to know each other. Noah started asking banal questions, which received banal answers. Realizing that everything was fine, the leader extended a contract with all the conditions. Their case began the day after tomorrow, and they couldn't be late. All over the world, gates were divided into two types. For example, they were disposable. And there were also continuous ones that could be farmed endlessly thanks to strategies. Our heroes set off for just such a gate, anticipating an easy victory. Carl looked around, feeling the strange atmosphere in the team. But behind him, the leader was walking with a girl, and they seemed to be familiar. Either way, Noah heard the sounds, which meant the battle was about to begin. All the players immediately tensed up and raised their weapons. Literally a moment later, a huge crowd of zombies was running towards them. The tank immediately began to run forward to carry out the main onslaught. Using his shield, the boy was able to push the monsters back. Soon after, it was the long-range shooter's turn, but our hero also rushed into battle, and Lu offered to kill all these creatures. The swordsman held his position while the archer helped him destroy the zombies. The boy mindlessly swung his blade left and right. Suddenly, a terrifying bolt of lightning flashed past him. Our hero tore apart all the dead people in one fell swoop, which means the first battle is theirs. Soon the boys had a chance to rest. Tank praised Carl, saying that he was a hero, but our hero sheepishly said that it was all just luck. A tank named Lester asked to be taken into his team after this incident. Carl felt awkward, because it was not very appropriate to have such conversations in front of the leader. The boys still continued to praise their savior. Just at that moment, Noah turned to the squad and informed them that they would be moving out. All the guys were ready, but Lu wasn't particularly happy to feed on the tasteless blood of zombies. In any case, there was soon to be a boss room for the ego to be sated with. But things weren't so calm in the team, because the tank and the swordsman started to argue. One way or another, after some time the guys were standing in front of huge gates. These huge bars were the division between them and the boss's room. The leader immediately began to tell the plan of action to fight the monster. Lester didn't really want to listen to this boring stuff because he had studied it all himself. But Noah still stood his ground, saying that this monster was very dangerous. Tank expressed his displeasure by looking away. Meanwhile, the unfamiliar girl was also losing her temper. Her eyes were redder. But the leader looked at her and calmed her down with just one look. Our hero was undoubtedly surprised to see this picture. Either way, they were soon inside and standing before a huge giant. The leader's plan was to attack the boss from behind with a powerful arrow. The giant immediately became angry and began waving his arms, destroying everything around him. In turn, the tank blocked all these impudent attacks. The rest of the squad dealt as much damage to the boss as possible. Soon the giant simply fell to the ground and bent over. Now it was our hero's turn to attack in the air. Right in flight, the power of his sword became even greater. A second later, Carl made a powerful swing with his demonic blade. Without blinking an eye, the huge guardian was destroyed, and Lu absorbed the experience and power. But experience was not the only reward, as Carl unlocked the cannibalism skill. And again, the tank and the swordsman began to idolize the guy, asking to be accepted into his team. Noah suddenly turned to the squad and informed them that they had received the boss's paralyzing dagger. Now, based on the contract, it was necessary to draw lots to divide the spoils. At this point, Lester approached Carl with a business proposition. The guy offered to take this dagger for himself because he did everything himself. Tank was going to help Carl together with the swordsman, and he had to listen to them. However, during his training, our hero learned to see right through people. Looking at these guys, he felt deception and hypocrisy. On the other hand, there was the leader and the girl, whose name he didn't even know. In any case, there was something incomprehensible hidden behind all this calm. Noah soon began to take out the dice to roll them. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Lester rushed into the attack with blade in hand. But even in front of the sharp blade and death, Noah didn't even bat an eye. Our hero at that moment intercepted Lester and threw him to the ground. The tank, perplexed, began to ask the swordsman for help, but he was already shaking with fear. All this was very dangerous because just a little more and he could have died. By the way, we are not talking about the leader, but about Lester, whom the girl was going to kill. Our hero didn't even see a blade in her hands, so he assumed that she was a magician. But she is not so simple. Noah is exactly the same magician. Our hero asked them who they were. The guys turned their heads in surprise. Noah laughed, saying that was what he wanted to ask him. In any case, it was now necessary to decide the fate of the imposter. Suddenly, the swordsman began to justify himself, saying that he was forced to conspire against the leader. Noah turned his head towards the girl and nodded. In literally the blink of an eye, the girl flew past the tank and the swordsman. The guys instantly fell to the ground, and our hero only made sure that it was dangerous. Either way, now there was one less problem. Our hero leaned over, deciding that he would take the dagger. He assumed it was right, since he had saved the leader's life. Suddenly, Noah asked the guy if he knew who he was. Carl decided that he didn't want to delve into this, spread rumors, but in any case, they are not ordinary people. Soon the guy even asked them to deal with the two bodies, and he would go hunting some more. Lou, perplexed, stated that this girl was very dangerous. Carl knew this himself, so he decided to speak to them neutrally and take the dagger for himself. By that time, the guys had farmed well and earned experience with zombies. Lou was still complaining about the taste of zombies, which meant it was time to get out of here. Right at the end, the guys decided to go into the rewards room. This room is a space that can be moved using the Guardian's corpse. Our hero was about to touch the monster but suddenly saw a strange wall. Approaching her, they began to study her, deciding that she was empty inside. Without thinking twice, Lou agreed with the owner that this wall needed to be broken down. The boy swung his blade and a pile of dust rose into the air. Within a moment, the ego began to rebel and behave strangely. Blade stated that he felt another ego in this place. Literally taking a couple of steps forward, Carl noticed a divine sword sticking out of the stone. Our hero approached it, assuming that it was Excalibur. My intuition advised me to simply pull out this blade. A moment later, the entire room was engulfed in a bright glow. Soon a new voice addressed the new master. The space was clean and white, something like the meeting with Lou. The guy talked to the ego and came to the conclusion that he was inside the sword, and it was waiting for its owner. Our hero stated that he was not its master but would like to become one. A few moments later, the guy nicknamed his new blade Ellie. Soon the gates began to collapse. It was time to escape from here. Lou and Ellie shouted in one voice that it was time to run away from here. The two egos communicated with each other in surprise and did not understand each other. One way or another, the only way out was through the body of the keeper. It was so dangerous that even the floor began to crumble into the abyss. In the end, the guy managed to teleport. And he did it in time. Otherwise, he would have faced inevitable death. So the gate disappeared, which was surprising, but no one understood the reason. There has been controversy around the world about this issue. But Carl was more interested in the rewards and the amulet, which was very useful to him. He couldn't cure his mother, but he was able to raise the family financially. The rest of the time, the guy decided to climb the floors of the tower. He easily made it to the 5th floor, where he was found unconscious. He then destroyed all the mobs on the 6th floor. The goblins on the 7th floor were like plush toys. The guy fought like a god of war and destroyed all the evil on the floors. Thus, he finally reached the 9th floor. At that time, the guy had significantly improved his swords, and they were incredibly powerful. The main thing he realized was that the stronger the ego, the stronger he was, being the 1st level. This only meant that the guys needed to find another ego. The guy went to the item auction, but Lou and Ellie didn't feel the aura of ego. But suddenly it appeared. The bracelet of wounds. It was the main lot of the auction. In one voice, the egos shouted, saying that they felt that very aura. But in the evening, the guy returned without this bracelet. However, the things there were not for his pocket. They even teased him, saying that the owner was a beggar. And yet, the guy became 100 million richer because he sold the dagger. In the evening, the guy was leaving the store talking to Davis. Carl told about his adventures, and the manager immediately scolded him. The guy wasn't against advancing in the tower, but Lu had been leveling up there for too long. And yet, he decided that everything would work out. The main thing was to find a good team. The guy was climbing the stairs, dreaming of moving with his family to a safe area. But suddenly, on his way, he encountered an unknown rift. At the same time, the rift activated and turned into a gate. Meanwhile, Davis was investigating the emergence of a new test. He also noticed that it was near Carl's house. However, as soon as he saw the applicant's name, he choked on his coffee. Since Carl was the applicant, he was given 5 days to enter the gate. Soon he told about all the subtleties and precautions. As soon as the man left, Davis invited Carl to come have a drink and talk. The man assumed that the boy wanted to go in there alone. Our hero was confident in his abilities, which is why he was determined. The man at that moment said that he was giving him 4 days to prepare, and then he had to come. So 4 days later, Carl came to the training room. Davis suddenly offered to join their association, but our hero refused, and Theon went to the guild, because the guides department was simply removed. Our hero was glad that the guy was able to change and improve his life. However, it was time for training and Davis challenged Carl, but our hero underestimated his boss. With one wave of his hand, the man moved the guy several meters. Davis was proud of himself and said that he was still good because he was a top ranker. Looking at the terrifying aura, the boy froze, but Lu ordered the master to attack. The guy knew one way or another that he couldn't win, but he decided not to stand still. The manager was pleased with this, which is why he began the attack again. Davis at one point suggested that he should fight easier. The top rankers were truly terrifying in battle. This was all preparation because behind the gates Carl could die even from a small mob. But still, the guy was well prepared for this battle. 4 days ago, he was wondering where he could find better equipment. They assured the owner that there was nothing nearby, so it was pointless. Suddenly, he saw beautiful armor. It's true that the price for them was too prohibitive. After just an hour of market research, both the guy and the ego had resigned themselves to poverty. But suddenly Lu and Ellie turned to the owner. Raising his head, he saw a boy arguing with adults. He tried to find buyers for his grandfather, whom he called a great master. Naturally, people didn't accept it and just laughed. And yet, our hero decided to turn to him. Carl asked to be taken to his grandfather's shop. The boy was incredibly happy about this because he was able to find a person. After some time, they descended into an incomprehensible basement. There was no doubt, because both egos felt the aura that emanated even from the boy's clothes. The guy was still worried until they entered the shop. Literally everything that was in this place was ego. But still, these weren't quite the same things as Lu and Ellie. These were unconscious objects, meaning they were just normal armor. Suddenly, the grandfather began to drive the visitor away, because he did not understand the value of his things. He knew the boy wouldn't be able to use a single thing here. Carl was persistent, so he made a bet to buy the item if he used it. Suddenly, the guy took the sword, read its name and level. The blacksmith was perplexed by the fact that the boy saw the characteristics of things. And yet, because of this, he allowed us to try using his things. Our hero swung the blade and named it Spearhead. It seemed that something incredible was about to happen. The earth would shake, thunder, lightning. But in reality, nothing happened at all. Putting the sword back, Ellie assumed he didn't like the name. Returning from his thoughts, the guy was still confronting the manager. But even with his gear, he couldn't even scratch Davis. The man felt that his student was nervous, which was a major mistake. Our hero decided to concentrate, but the attacks were too thoughtless and chaotic. Eventually, Davis got tired of dodging endlessly, so he punched Carl. In that very shop, he examined literally every single thing, but all was in vain. Even Lu said that they are all second-rate and picky about the choice of owner. Soon the guy, out of desperation, decided to try to use the ego one last time. He took a liking to one breastplate, which he named Brunheart. At that very moment, he succeeded in establishing a connection with this ego. It wasn't as powerful because some of the skills were missing, but that wasn't a problem. The moment Davis hit Carl, the breastplate literally reflected his own attack. But even so, our hero managed to suffer a little. After such a battle, the manager threw a healing potion to his student. The guy sighed heavily, assuming that he had failed, but Davis claimed that he passed because he was able to scratch it during the battle. But this was not an accident. It was Carl's original and well-thought-out plan. After some time, Davis led the student to the gate and gave him a week to clean up. After this period, he himself will appear at the gate and take Carl. Once Davis had checked that he had the necessary items, the guy was ready to go inside. After just a few moments, the guy said goodbye to everyone and went inside. Now the task was to find out what type of gate this was. The only option was to simply clear the entire space of monsters. Our hero assumed that he would quickly clean everything up anyway. Some pathetic wolves were not a problem for him, and even less so for Lou. The guy got rid of one monster with a light swing. It's true that along with this wolf there was also a pack of ferocious monsters. Our hero was looking forward to causing a massacre and leveling up. The guy started to beat up everyone around him and raise his ego levels. After some time, it was time to rest. At that point, 5 hours of non-stop wolf slaughter had passed. This floor was no different from the goblins due to its F rank. But soon the guy came to the conclusion that he still could not improve his level. His ego goes a long way and he won't even be able to get a normal grade. And Davis couldn't help him with that either. But Ellie suddenly said that with the development of the owner, they will be able to establish communication at a distance. And still Carl had no idea how to develop. In the same way, he did not understand the very acquired skill of cannibalism for Lou. One way or another, it was time to end the rest and move on. But the backpack was already full. It was worth buying a magic one. Inside, the guy saw potions of enhancement, which means that if he drinks them, a place will appear. After drinking them, he improved himself and set off on his way to the keeper. Thus he walked for a long time. The potions should have run out soon, but still a glow met them at the end of the tunnel. There was indeed a guardian outside, which was different from the huge zombie. The gatekeeper, sensing the player, immediately came to his senses. Ego was warned that the fight would be tough. And yet, there was no time to waste. The monster had already rushed to attack. At first, the guy dodged, but his time came to counterattack. The wolf's skin was thick, which meant another plan was needed. A moment later, the giant wolf sent the boy flying. Attacking was useless, so all that was left was to accumulate damage and destroy it. Our hero was a pro at protracted battles, which is why he began to act. The boy used all his skills to anger the wolf. He, in turn, attacked the player more and more. After some time, the giant was defeated. The boy knew that without Brunheart he would not have survived here. Looking at the fierce wolf, there was an understanding that he was much stronger than the previous guardian. One way or another, it was time to put an end to this giant. Lou instantly began to absorb the monster's blood and experience. But in addition to these rewards, the system notified about the use of the cannibalism skill. The giant wolf began to melt into space and disappear. Soon he was successfully transformed by the ego. Now only the crystal remained of the wolf. Lou and Ellie had no idea what it was, and didn't know that the monster could be transformed into an ego. There wasn't even the slightest clue what it was, but I had to move on. Suddenly, opening the information window, Carl noticed that the ego belonged to him. They had to figure out how to summon him, but fortunately, they learned how cannibalism works. The guy decided to go to the reward room, but there was a small problem. Lou absorbed the guardian's body and it disappeared. Our hero had no intention of leaving with empty gates and simply spent whole days looking for a room. If he leaves without going through the reward room, something terrible might happen. At the very least, a gate rupture could occur, which would harm people. According to the deadline, Davis will arrive in 4 days, which means there is time before he arrives. On the 3rd day, the guy combed every corner but still found nothing. At some point, he suggested that all the monsters needed to be destroyed. Lou and Ellie agreed, so soon they began to destroy all the creatures. On the 5th day, the boy finally destroyed the last wolf. Now it remained to be seen whether anything would change. He even suggested that the cave should be destroyed, but they stopped the owner in time, saying that they felt something. All the energy of the gates was collected in one place near the gatekeeper. The guy went there immediately. After some time, Davis and Carl were discussing what had happened. The manager did not understand why he came out so late. The guy told about his whole journey and about the problem that happened. Now Davis understood why Carl had so many crystals. But that was not all that happened then. He didn't even know how to properly describe his thoughts. It seemed as if pieces of the world were accumulating in one place. The guy received the ego fragments and was then sent to the reward room. Based on what happened, Carl assumed that the gate was the ego. After leaving the hospital, Davis said he would send money for the crystals a little later. And there were also plans to go to the hospital and visit my mother. In this case, the manager offered to give Carl a ride, since it was on his way. The guy didn't really want to go on his, but Davis was perplexed. A real man's car must be pink. Soon our heroes arrived at the hospital. Carl pointed out to his sister that she could use some sleep. The girl, in turn, said that she remembered about the exams. Suddenly, they met a grandmother in front of them. The woman decided to go for a walk at such a late hour and heard some acquaintances. She started to have a nice conversation, and even said that Carl had a good aura. After that, she went about her business and wished him a good night. Suddenly, she stopped and called Carl. Grandmother felt that several energies were colliding within him. Therefore, when she left, she wished him to overcome all difficulties. Of course, the guy had no idea what this meant. But maybe she knew something. The next day, the guy was incredibly happy to get some sleep in a normal hotel. It seemed like the day was going to be great, but Carl met his mother's doctor. The guy asked what happened, to which the man began to act strangely, choosing his words. The action takes us to the gate, where there were already a bunch of players. The guys finished the raid and were getting ready to go and rest. Suddenly, a rather familiar guy started walking past them. They immediately realized that this was the tutorial killer and decided to go and say hello. But when they noticed the guy's face, they immediately stopped because something was wrong. That day, the doctor said that his mother was not getting better, and quite the opposite, was only getting worse. The care was good, but they came to the hospital too late. But all this was nothing, because the main problem was something unknown. At best, the woman was given a year to live, and at worst, about 3 months. This was the fuel for Carl to become better. The boy went hunting alone against huge buffaloes. Carl blamed himself for his mother's illness because he was too weak. If he had gained this power earlier, he would have saved his mother. And yet, he simply hunted for days on end. Even Lou, who loved to kill monsters, assumed that the owner had gone crazy. But Ellie, on the contrary, supported her owner, understanding his suffering. In this way, we are transported all the way to the 19th floor. The guys who were there met a strange guy with a bunch of resources, and someone decided to laugh, offering help to the Wanderer. These guys were the Smurf Guild. But for them it was a mistake because Carl didn't like jokes. The most daring of them immediately tensed up and began to try to hush up the conflict. But our hero was incredibly angry at the one who wanted to take away someone else's. People looked into his fierce eyes and did not understand where so much anger came from. But luckily for the Smurf Guild, a guy from the association showed up and came running to the noise. Instantly, the bunch of losers just ran away, telling Carl that they remembered him. Shortly afterwards, a player association official asked what had happened. Our hero explained what happened and who did it. Even the man was surprised by the amount of cargo the Wanderer was carrying. One way or another, he recognized the guy as a player named Carl. It turned out that our hero had been wanted for more than 1 day. Davis, in turn, decided to give Joseph a double bonus for finding Carl. He then expressed his displeasure that the guy had literally spent 2 weeks in the tower without communication. But that wasn't the only reason they were looking for him. It turns out that they found a way to cure Carl's mother. It was a panacea elixir that could cure any disease. But this is an incredibly rare thing and has only been found 3 times in all time. The conditions were unclear, but they were given randomly on high floors of the tower or gate. The labyrinth gates that our hero studied were ideal for this. They were distinguished by the presence of various monsters, traps, and a strong guardian. Davis suddenly announced that a 3rd labyrinth gate had appeared in the States 2 days ago. Obviously, our hero had to be sent there. Well, Davis will exchange all the acquired resources and send the money to Carl. Our hero was supposed to be accompanied by Joseph. Davis was told to take responsibility for Carl's health. One way or another, everything necessary was prepared, which meant it was time to set off. But our hero still had something to do. The guy passed the 20th floor and received various upgrades. At least his fusion skill was now at rank E. He felt a little better. Joseph was very surprised that the guy finished this floor so quickly. Usually, it took more than a day to clean it up. Our hero didn't understand what was wrong. But the guy reminded him that only 20 minutes had passed. One way or another, the guys turned it all into a joke and decided to hit the road. They weren't going to fly on a plane, but went to a giant tower of enormous size. It was possible to meet different people in it, because the tower was connected with all parts of the planet. After going up the elevator, it turned out that the entire building was powered by crystals. Our hero was soon able to see the control center of the transition portal between the countries. Previously, he could not even imagine that he would be able to travel in this way. In any case, they soon found the desired portal in the USA. It was high time to use the fastest transport in the world. Within 30 minutes, they were driving in a car along the highway. At this time, Carl was studying the news, which contained interesting news. 3 top rankers were ready to participate in the capture of the gate: American Iron Shield, European Athena, and also the Korean Demon King. Our hero even doubted that he would be able to cope when such guys were involved. Anyway, soon they came to a place called the Hell of this world. A huge gap. They are also the 3rd gate labyrinth. At this time, someone was watching our heroes. The guy assumed that they were from the association, since it was the first time he saw them. And our hero conducted a check on the security guard, who was shocked by the first level. The guys watching them were no less surprised. The girl with purple hair took off her glasses and said with a smile that this guy was definitely her type. One way or another, soon our hero was fighting huge monsters. At first, Joseph continued to accompany and help the guy. Together, they were quite a close-knit team. Having easily dealt with the monsters, it was now time to split up. They hunted for 15 hours, but he already had to go home. Carl thanked for his help in mastering the gate. Thus, our hero was left alone and decided to mark the paths inside the gate. At that point, a week had passed and he could easily destroy 3 giant spiders. But it still came down to stagnation because he was fighting one type of monster. There should have been stronger monsters closer to the boss. By the way, before leaving, Joseph left a gift for the guy. Our hero received the thread of Arachne, which allowed him to be transported to the entrance to the gate. But still, Carl didn't even think about using it until he found the elixir. Suddenly, there was a loud child's cry. Lou and Ellie were on guard, anticipating a fight. Only soon the little girl's voice began to sound strange. But it was still better to check the trap to avoid it in the future. Coming closer, our hero actually saw a girl who needed help. Now even Carl assumed that this was strange. She was too young to be here, and she was Korean too. The guy still decided to turn around and pretend that he didn't see her. Right at the moment when he was about to leave, the girl began to turn to her mother. She apologized to her for not being able to find money for treatment. Lou was sure that this was a hook to trap people. But our hero was partial to this topic, which is why he saved a little girl from imprisonment. After some time, they got to know each other, and it turned out that she was simply lost. This girl's name is Ava, and she had the ability, skill enhancement. Most likely, it was due to her strengthening that she was brought here, even despite the age of this young player. And yet, our hero handed her a kit for setting up a safety zone. She could sit quietly for about a day and wait for help. But Ava jumped up in bewilderment and screamed. She began to beg to be taken with him. Carl sharply rejected her offer because players must be responsible for their own lives. But the girl was very persistent because she wanted to be a good helper. Her desire was to level up, since she had recently become a player. Still, Carl's goals were different from hers, so he had no intention of returning. Suddenly, he declared that it would be dangerous further on. They would split the rewards, but he would not give up the elixir. Ava immediately realized that he was taking her with him. Carl assumed that with her skills, hunting would be even easier. Soon they had the opportunity to fight shoulder to shoulder. Our hero ran to attack and Ava began to strengthen him. Thanks to magic, the guy destroyed the monsters even faster, literally in one jerk. Lou, in turn, only happily devoured all the creatures. So they hunted for 2 weeks, and Ava really was a relief. By that time, the girl was able to raise her level, which she bragged about during dinner. They continued to chat about all sorts of things, but suddenly, our hero fell silent because he felt something. Approaching the edge of the wall, he began to look out. To his horror, he saw a large guild with a top ranker. The American Iron Shield led a huge army. Carl immediately realized that their presence could clearly be sensed. The guy started to crawl away because they could run into a fight. But it was not possible to do this, because a moment later the wall was destroyed. A huge sword was sticking out of the ground, which Carl almost cut through. The guild member asked the master why he did this. The man shrugged, assuming he was simply mistaken. Fortunately, our heroes were still able to escape into a nearby cave. Ava didn't understand why they were running away anyway. Carl replied that they looked like spies, and that this is simply forbidden between players. Now it was time to come up with a new plan. Keep a small distance and follow. Soon our heroes came across the mark. This meant that all the monsters were destroyed, as were the traps, and the guild itself moved on. Only when the guy turned his head he didn't notice Ava nearby. Suddenly both egos screamed in unison, warning their master of the danger. Right behind him stood the guild leader who had caught the rat. Carl didn't even have time to say anything and soon came face to face with the ground. Time after time, the man slammed the spy into the ground. After some time, Carl was finally able to wake up. Now he was being interrogated, and the master wanted to know who had sent them. The guy understood that this was a problem because he didn't even know their language. In broken English, he began to assure them that he was not a spy and asked them not to kill him. The boys were surprised that he didn't understand them, but he could also be pretending. The master left the rest of the work to Rogers. This player joined the Iron Guild as a Korean American. The guy immediately started talking to Carl in their language, refraining from introducing himself. At that point, they examined all of his items and he realized that Carl was Korean by his backpack. What was surprising was that the guy seemed friendly. Rogers wanted to know why they were being spied on. Our hero began to tell it like it is, that he is an ordinary player without a guild on a hunt. But Rogers seemed to be expecting to hear that, causing him to sigh heavily. At the same moment, he pulled out a blade, which he thrust into Carl's leg. He asked them not to take them for fools, because he knew for sure that he was not here for hunting. The main reason Carl was here was for the elixir. At this time, the blacksmith was talking about a sword whose information window was not visible. Thomas decided that he would have to take it to a workshop, but keep it for now. They were talking about Ellie, which they presented as a regular old piece of iron. Meanwhile, Rogers continued to torture Carl and heal him with potions. He wanted to know whose plan it was that brought this pathetic player here. And again, our hero began to say what he had already said. Of course, Rogers simply didn't believe it. They managed to check his stats, and in his hands was a regular rope, not an item for players. It all boiled down to the fact that he was delirious since he couldn't remove the rope. Thomas decided to have a bite to eat before continuing. Having given the prisoner a final blow, he went to dinner, but advised him to think it over. Our hero suddenly realized that without his weapon, he was completely helpless. At this moment, another guild was watching the guild and the prisoner, thanks to magic. The distance was 2 kilometers, which is why they had to decide what to do. The decision now depended on the woman in the mask. During this time, our hero endured the most terrible tortures, including beatings and even amputations. After the 200th time, he stopped counting altogether. He had been in captivity for 3 days. The whole guild was deciding what to do with this guy. Thomas even wanted to recruit him, but this guy was too weak, though. Suddenly, the guildmaster turned to Bruce and asked him to bring the boy's sword. He wanted to show respect and kill the owner of the sword with his own weapon. The guild assumed that entering the gate's history was an honorable death. As soon as Thomas took the blade, he walked up to the guy and stabbed him. This was their mistake, because by doing so, the connection with Lou was restored. At that very second, he broke free from captivity. Now he used his sword and attacked Thomas. The entire guild was horrified by what they saw, but for the top ranker, this was a trifle, so he calmly grabbed the sword. It turned out that he had initially sensed the Demon King's energy and that Carl was hiding power. And yet, it was unclear how such a weakling had deceived his insight. At that moment, our hero didn't even know what to do or what to say. Suddenly, the masked woman used an initiation attack. At that very second, a magic arrow flew through Thomas's hand. This meant that the Athena Guild had met with an iron shield. The boy broke the arrow, perceiving it as a declaration of war. The woman laughed, saying that he had become better at telling jokes. There has never been a time when they didn't fight. At the same second, Athena attacked Thomas's guild. The guildmaster had no intention of standing still. He instantly thrust his sword into the ground. Soon the title of Iron Shield was justified as he summoned a huge shield and absorbed the attack. The collision of powerful charges caused an incredible explosion. Either way, Thomas approached Rogers and asked him to keep an eye on the spy. He soon dispelled the magic and promised Athena to put an end to them. Only the girl perceived this as another stupid joke. Right here and now, a new war between 2 guilds has broken out. There were screams, explosions, lightning, huge bursts of energy everywhere. Rogers laughed, calling those guys real monsters. Sometimes it could even be compared to a battle of gods. While he was calmly talking, our hero, one might say, was fighting for survival. Rogers held out as long as he could, but assumed that he could circumvent the master's order. For example, as if he accidentally killed him because the spy was dying. At that very moment, he literally evaporated from his place. In a second, he was already behind Carl, deciding not to leave him alive. Our hero knew too much, but he didn't want to give up either. At the moment of the collision, Carl cleverly used Brunheart. Literally, the entire force of the attack was reflected, causing an explosion. Fortunately, Rogers was defeated and the threat passed. But due to the damage limit being exceeded, Brunheart was simply destroyed. Our hero soon decided to take revenge for both himself and his ego. Rogers, in the face of death, began to beg for mercy. However, Carl had no intention of sparing him, just as they had no intention of sparing him. All this time, Brunheart took the attacks, but the reflections were too great. Our hero felt like his blood simply wouldn't stop. Suddenly, a girl loomed over the boy, calling him the same name as his sister. However, it turned out that it was Ava. Suddenly, the girl asked what would happen if she saved him and then got the elixir. Her sly smile wanted to know her benefit and what he would give in return. She assumed that he could give his life or become her eternal slave. But our hero suddenly asked for a couple more things. He wanted to get rid of the Iron Shield once and for all. He also wanted to destroy the entire Iron Guild. Although it was already 2 requests and not 1, the girl asked if they were making a bet. Suddenly, Carl asked to return his sword, which the old man had. The girl laughed and asked how many more additional conditions she would hear. Just at that moment, a guy I knew before came up. Ava admired Carl, saying that he can be kind, but is actually evil inside. And what's more, she saw how Carl executed that freak. The girl knew that this was his first murder, but he did everything precisely. Our hero hit a vital organ and did everything without hesitation. The man suddenly asked Ava what she would do with him since he had a fatal wound. She decided that Rogers would just be left there, and if he survived, it would be fate. Suddenly, the girl's hair began to change. The man laughed, assuming that the Demon King had arrived. But Ava said that she is more likely to be the one to kill the Demon King. At this time, our hero fell into a nightmare that had already tormented him for 5 years. After meeting Lou, he had not seen him, but the first level surrounded him again. Suddenly, our hero simply grabbed the well ladle. This is due to the fact that he overcame the wall, but was still at the bottom of the well. His own consciousness was mocking him. Roughly speaking, he was lucky that he caught the rope, but he will never climb up. But a voice behind him called out to Carl, asking him to stop playing the poor guy. He had power that was lent to him. The dark voice said that he only had strength acquired through effort and luck. Our hero did not understand who it was, but another voice was heard from behind. The girl turned to the owner and said that her power belonged entirely to him. A moment later, the guy jumped up in a cold sweat. Looking around, he noticed an unfamiliar guy. Carl decided that he was connected to Ava, or the Demon King. One way or another, the guy threw both swords that Carl asked him to find. But it was too early to go further because the wounds still needed to be healed. Our hero resigned himself and sat down on the ground, but suddenly saw something in the sky. Ava was floating in the air, radiating an incredible aura. Everything on Earth began to collapse and be attracted to her. Joshua watched the Legion commander and assumed that Carl was seeing something like this for the first time. Soon a huge monster loomed in the space, which was the master of the labyrinth. Ava was going to fight this giant. Suddenly, another gate began to appear above the master of the labyrinth, Geryon. Joshua turned to Carl and advised him to come closer, otherwise he would die. Suddenly, the boy used blood magic and created a talisman around himself. This is a protective dome that has become their shelter. Meanwhile, monsters began to fly out of the gates of Geryon. A moment later, a horde of dragons covered Ava, and it seemed that certain death awaited her. But suddenly she used her ability, Black Flame. A huge shadow blade appeared in the sky, which could destroy all living things. Roger's words immediately came to mind about this truly being a battle of gods. Ava soon swung her sword and slammed him into the ground. The impact was incredibly powerful, and soon there was a surge of energy. After some time, all that was left of the boss was a dried-up field. This meant that the hour of rewards had come. Our hero still received the elixir of panacea, for which the owner was congratulated. But the guy didn't fully understand what had happened. From all appearances, he was rather confused, but Ava kept her promise. This meant that only revenge remained, but still Carl was not a murderer. One way or another, everyone who was in the room received their rewards. She also had an elixir. Likewise, Joshua received the coveted award. Only then Ava suddenly reached out and handed over another can of Carl. She decided that it would be more logical than destroying the Iron Guild. His body was badly damaged, so it was better to heal himself. Their goal was the Legion commander, not the reward for him. The guy held the jar in his hands, shocked that he got everything so easily. He decided that he needed to become much stronger so that he could rely on himself and only himself. But since Carl got his, Ava should get hers too. Instead of being offered the chance to become a slave, Carl was forced to become her apprentice. She herself saw how weak he was, so she wanted to deal with him when he passed the 50th floor. Suddenly, she flicked him on the head, which was surprising. What is this? As it turned out, it was a sign of agreement and a means of communication. Carl's mission was to learn as much as possible. Ava soon noticed that the guy's swords were quite unusual. She knew how to improve one of the swords, which surprised Carl. It was a dangerous method, and everything had to be done perfectly, which meant drinking the elixir. The action takes us to the battlefield where two guilds fought. Both egos said in one voice that this girl was dangerous, and yet the guy himself did not understand what he was doing here, opposite Thomas. The guy had almost dealt with the Athena Guild at that point. He was also unhappy that the Demon King destroyed the boss in an instant. The girl said that the strongest wins. Soon she began sending Carl ahead and doing as she said. Although he was scared, he still screamed and turned to the Iron Shield. In broken English, the guy promised to kill him. It's safe to say that Thomas liked this attitude. At the same moment, he made a dash towards Carl. He couldn't help but notice that the boy had changed and was now serving the Demon King. One way or another, he was going to kill Carl. Some time ago, our hero finally drank the elixir. The system notified that he had recovered. But the guy didn't feel anything at all, except that it got a little better. Ava assured him that this was normal and that only his capabilities and potential had changed. The main difference between life and death was to be revealed in battle. Now he could watch and react to everything that was happening. The guy was able to calmly dodge the deadly attack of the iron shield. It can be said that he increased the resolution of feelings. Although Thomas previously seemed invincible and elusive, Ava mentally congratulated the student because he became one step closer to the top ranker. But it still wasn't on par with the iron shield. This meant that it was necessary to think of a weapon with which to kill the enemy. At the moment, Thomas was relaxed, simply because he was incredibly strong. But he himself could already understand that Carl had used the elixir, since he had become a little better. This meant that he would now attack even more furiously. Activating the power of the sacred sword, the boy made a dash towards the enemy. Our hero didn't want to stand there like a coward, so he had to act. Suddenly, Ellie began to awaken and absorb the skills of Thomas's sacred sword. The guy didn't understand what was happening, but part of his sword's power passed to Ellie. Now our hero needed to increase the distance between them. Soon after, he took out the thread of Arachne that Joseph had given him. Instantly, the guy began to leave the battlefield. Thomas realized what was happening, but he was not going to let it go. Carl kindly gestured to his opponent just before leaving. And yet, he managed to escape. Now, only the Iron Shield and the Demon King remained on the battlefield. This meant that no one could interfere with their conversation. At that time, people gathered a huge army to hold back the enemy if necessary. And also, Joshua arrived just in time to pick up Carl. Our heroes met, which meant it was time to go home. Naturally, they went to the hospital and took Carl's mother home. After that, the guy wanted to meet Davis. Soon, Joshua said goodbye to Carl, because he had done his job and needed to move on. At that moment, the woman already looked very bad. Luckily, she was able to recognize her son and was very happy to see him. At some point, she began to think that she would die and not see Carl. Nevertheless, the guy reassured her that everything would be fine now. Still, the woman still wanted to say something. The truth is she couldn't do this because the pain began to break her body. Our hero instantly pulled out the elixir and gave it to his mother to drink. Soon it took effect, and all that was left was to wait. The guy was incredibly happy that he succeeded, and soon he himself fell to the ground. They understood that the owner was too tired lately. Ellie, in turn, was worried about her connection with the Demon King. But Lou knew that they simply couldn't do anything, so it was time to at least rest. Already that night, something strange began to happen to Carl's mother. The woman suddenly woke up, emitting an incomprehensible aura. At this time, Mary was walking down the street trying to call her brother. Carl sent her only one message in a whole month and never responded again. She was determined to come home and start a fight. The girl ran inside and started screaming and complaining about her brother. However, her face changed from anger to surprise. In the kitchen stood Mother, asking Mary to be quiet, offering her to eat. The girl couldn't believe her eyes, which caused tears to appear in her eyes. After some time, our hero woke up from the noise in the kitchen. As soon as he stood up, he was still trying to understand what was happening. Suddenly, his nose caught the scent of his mother's soup. Looking at the door, he understood that when he opened it, he would see what he had dreamed of so much. He had to smile calmly and pretend that everything was as usual. The guy did just that, and a moment later he screamed in shock. When he saw his mother, you could tell he had another sister. Mary laughed, saying that her brother was even more surprised than she was. Anyway, soon they discussed everything they could and had a delicious dinner. Our hero told about his adventures and how he bypassed top rankers. The funny thing was that Carl also didn't know what the effect of the elixir would be. Meanwhile, Mom was shining brighter than anyone else. Mary didn't know whether to be happy, surprised, or cry. The girl jokingly asked to get her such a cool elixir too. Suddenly, Mom turned to Carl thanking him. But she still felt guilty for forcing her son to take such a risk. The guy smiled and said it wasn't that hard. One way or another, the very next day Davis came to visit. The woman was glad to see him and asked him to take care of Carl. After some time, the guys came to a local eatery. It was time to discuss how our hero obtained this elixir. However, instead of answering the question, another more pointed question followed. Carl asked the manager if he liked his mother. The man spat out everything he had drunk and soon even turned red, which was impossible not to notice. Carl summed it up by saying that he would be all for it, because he saw that he liked her. After all, he considered him a father and part of the family. Nevertheless, Davis decided to return to the conversation. The story promised to be confusing and long. After some time, Davis was furious with the Iron Guild. He wanted to smash everyone there to smithereens. All he needed was the address. But there was no point in getting angry, because everything was fine. Carl was going to destroy the entire guild with his own hands. And yet, if the conversation had gone in this direction, then something else was interesting. The guy asked Davis what happened to the fourth floor keeper. Recently, a C-rank squad was sent there for extermination. With such powers, they could destroy even the guardian of the 30th floor. All they could do was wait for the report, even though Carl wanted to do everything for them. Meanwhile, the action moves to a gloomy forest. The guy who lost his arm ran with the desire to bring everything to the association. It turned out that the entire C-rank squad was completely wiped out. The next day, Carl met with Joshua, who talked about his mother. They had to wipe away all the strange news about her and the elixir. And yet, on top of everything else, the reward was a yellow crystal. The guy gave half the cost to his boss, even though he didn't want it. Now our hero had about 20 billion won left. And the question about the new house was relevant. Joshua found the perfect fit and was about to show the house. Our hero was completely bewildered and unwilling to do anything. He was still more surprised that Joshua even helped with finding a home. The guy just decided to say that Davis appointed him as a personal secretary for the player Carl. So now our hero had the best secretary. They arrived in the Donamon area in the evening. The secretary prepared everything that was needed, but there was still a large sum left. Carl decided to pay off his debts and buy new equipment. True, the price was unpleasant, 3.5 billion won. Our hero borrowed Brunheart from his grandfather that day. By the way, the action soon moves to him. The grandson informed his grandfather that guests had come to visit them. Of course, it was Carl who came with a huge amount of money. The man was glad to see the guy who had changed a lot in just a few months. Soon, he said that he received the money that he sent through the agent. It's true that a certain amount of money was missing there. The letter sent looked like a will. He thought that the boy would not survive and intended to start a collection for the funeral. It's true that the guy came back to pay off his debts, but without Brunheart. Our hero said that he saved his life and died. Grandfather decided that this was what he was born for, and therefore there was no point in grieving. Soon they were chatting until late into the night. The next morning, our hero was going to go somewhere with his mother. Mary was sleepy, which is why she forgot that they were going to the hospital for a checkup. Suddenly, the girl rubbed her eyes because she seemed to see something. She screamed in bewilderment, telling her brother that he had grown up. Even in the locker room, Joshua told Carl that he was just like a real model. Our hero's body has really changed. He has become more muscular. Apparently, the elixir worked very well if it even grew upward. But before, he was constantly involved in sports, but there were no results. Presumably, this was due to the restoration of the bowl. One way or another, the results of the inspection were already ready. Joshua concluded that the guy could break all Olympic records. Carl asked to say everything according to modern standards. The guy decided to laugh again, telling him that he was about level 10. Of course, the level was the first. But there was one good difference. Joshua shouted, saying that he had SS rank power and the potential of a top ranker. At Joshua's request, the guy responded calmly, but it was too calm. After all, our hero has already heard this from the Demon King. He soon met Davis, who was visiting Carl's mother. The woman was healthy, and her muscle strength was even higher than that of the average adult man. The most amazing thing was that she could now use objects while being human. But there were no more details because Davis came on other business. He saw that Carl had been taking a break from hunting lately. But in reality, Ellie was still absorbing Callion's power, so it took time. The guy was planning to start after the weekend. In a thoughtful voice, the man asked him to be free the following week. Rumors have reached us that the C-rank squad is out of contact. This only meant that the guardian of the fourth floor was still at large. But the worst thing is that he hunts players and gains strength at their expense. While they were discussing important matters, Joshua also wanted to take part in the conversation. They were going to send B-rank players into battle, about 30 people. Among them was Carl, a seemingly intimidating guy. But the truth is, his level never increased. Davis still ordered me to go through a commission to determine my level. He was much stronger, meaning with his potential he could be around B rank. But that was wrong, because this rank was higher than level 100, and he was still first. There really wasn't much point in the level. What was important was the unique abilities and power. But increasing the characteristics was still important. The higher the level, the more power. Davis agreed, but his case would still be legendary. He couldn't stop the rumors from spreading about the birth of a new top ranker. Carl wasn't against it. The only problem was the Iron Guild. Still, there was nothing Davis could do about it. It was not even possible to transfer the levels. His case is unique. But everyone knew that the level had a strong influence on the attitude towards the player. Our hero already knew all these words. Suddenly Davis cried out, saying that there was a way out after all. He could temporarily join a guild and sign up for a raid through connections. But that seemed like a strange idea, since he could have been put on the list of those eliminated. However, upon noticing a familiar name, our hero simply changed his mind about his words. Soon, the players became acquainted with the raid leader, Mason. He was going to check all the participants and immediately go into battle. There were simply countless people on this floor. Our hero joined the squad of old acquaintances, Zane, Emma, Marvin, and Peter. Zane was glad to meet here together, even though their guild power was only C rank. Carl laughed and thanked them that he was not a porter at all and would be able to help in the battle. But it is still unclear whether they will be able to fight, because they were very important people. For example, that same Captain Mason, who will soon receive A rank. From this rank, he would be considered a top ranker. But it was surprising, especially when compared to the Demon King. Suddenly, Emma said that Carl had become more handsome. The guys assumed that he had actually had surgery. The guy was surprised that he had changed so much that he was receiving compliments from everyone. He explained that it was not an operation and that he had obtained one skill on the 5th floor. The guys also wanted to find such a useful skill for change. Soon they began to discuss what and how was happening with them. Meanwhile, one guild watched them with disdain. In any case, a search party soon began searching for the keeper. The rest of the guys had to rest before the upcoming battle. Our hero sat with his boys and watched them attentively. From memory, Zane is an archer, Emma is a magician. Peter is a tanker, but Marvin is a swordsman. Carl asked why the guild is called Morning Star, since no one uses it. Emma started laughing at that moment until Zane stopped her. Marvin suddenly said that Zane came up with this name because of him. When he ran out of the cave, he was shining like the morning star. Zane turned very red at this point and told everyone to stop laughing. Soon our hero suggested that they address him informally, since he was not their guide. The guys started chatting about various achievements. Suddenly, they were interrupted by a voice that decided that the world had changed a lot. Those same jocks came to them and decided to get to the bottom of it. Our hero had no idea who these upstarts were, so he asked who they were. Zane explained that they were B rank, and from the Brother Guild, they were the main ones in this raid. These guys were quite famous. They value only strength, and in the guild they follow traditions, hierarchy, and loyalty. In other words, these are ordinary boomers. The boys suddenly started laughing at the inferior C-rank guys. Peter wanted to give them hell, but Emma stopped him in time. Only they continued to bully ordinary C-rank players. They didn't want to see trash on the battlefield that was of no use. All the guys were tense, and our hero began to behave differently. At this time, the guys snorted and decided that it was boring here. Turning around, they went to dig into the next people. Zane immediately apologized to Carl for being offended by their weakness. Our hero simply remained silent, looking at the ground. Meanwhile, Mason stood in front, surveying the area. Suddenly, he began to feel a terribly powerful aura behind him. At this time, the ego asked the owner to control himself and not do anything stupid. The guy simply couldn't control himself, and yet he understood that what happened should not go beyond the bounds. Suddenly, Mason came up to them and brought Carl back to his senses. The man noticed that some kind of skirmish had occurred there. As a leader, he had to assess the situation but not interrogate them. Carl suddenly had an idea. He informed that there had indeed been a quarrel, so he had a request. He asked to fight the impudent player Charles and solve their problem. The guy from the Brother Guild turned around in bewilderment and asked what kind of nonsense this was. Mason understood that the difference in ranks was great, which made him worried about Carl. Our hero knew all this, but real fighting power was much more important than ranks. In any case, for the victory, he asked to change the positions of the Brother and Morning Star Guild. Charles just started laughing, saying that he was far from them. But our hero promised 500 million won if they won. The boys were now at a loss. Should they fight or give in? But they still decided that he would not lie in front of witnesses. Without thinking twice, the guild leader decided to stop the chaos on the battlefield. Mason was still thinking about his feelings at this time. There might not have been a better opportunity for him to check, so he agreed. After some time, the circle had gathered and the duel was about to begin. Since weapons could not be used, Zane held Carl's swords. Mentally, the egos told the owner that this distance was enough for them to communicate. If there was a connection, then all the power was there. Charles suddenly advised his opponent to attack, because he didn't want to win in 5 seconds. Our hero knew for sure that this guy was B rank. It remained to find weak points, but presumably it was an ordinary tank. There was no doubt that he had at least one hidden weapon. It was worth trying a speed attack anyway, so the guy made a dash. Carl trusted his own wits more than his battle analysis. Charles, on the other hand, didn't even flinch, which could mean two things. He is either confident or has a special skill. It was too late to retreat. A counterattack had to be expected. Once the guy had hit with all his might, he waited for the time to attack again. It's true, the giant simply fell to the ground. In the blink of an eye, Charles was defeated. Just like the Brother Guild, Mason was also surprised. But soon, the raid leader announced the victory of the player Carl. The boys, perplexed, began to congratulate their friend. At this time, the guild brother tried to save Charles. Only Mason analyzed Carl and understood one truth. This guy was destined to be the most significant figure of this raid. One way or another, soon someone called out to the leader. It turned out that the search party had just returned. The action moves to the office of the association president. The man was leafing through a document about the participants of today's raid. Suddenly, the association president turned to Davis. The training hall and the portal between the countries were used. A hospital for their employees and Joshua's personal secretary. Davis was too much for a player who wasn't on their team. This is what the man asked for an explanation for. Meanwhile, all the raid participants went into battle. The huge giant was played with by players like ordinary toys. The player's profession had the highest mortality rate, and it was worth getting used to it. But when there are only predators around, for them, you become ordinary prey. It was hard to get used to this anyway. At this point, Mason decided to take action, causing him to swing his blade. The guy used a hydro cut and attacked the floor guardian. It seemed like it would cause significant damage, but the giant only got angry. Now all that was left was to go into battle. The giant was mad, he waved his arms, and the tactics were simple. After the leader attacked, the tanks entered the battle. They all used stone shield skills. The moment the giant attacked them, they easily repelled the attack. Next came the porters below D rank. They will throw explosive objects that they brought with them. They will be assisted in this by long-range fighters in order to detonate the bombs. The tactics were too simple and effective. Everything went like clockwork. From such a huge explosion, most likely no one should have survived. However, one should not be too confident in oneself. Suddenly, our hero turned to Zane. In this raid, it was worth keeping a low profile and assessing the situation. The guy didn't understand what this was about, because they had already determined the positions of the main forces. However, a moment later there was a crash that changed his mind. The Guardian smashed the tanker's stone shields to smithereens. It only meant that the tactic had a significant drawback. The giant was able to break through and came to all the players. In case of failure, a chaotic battle could now break out. And everything really happened just like that. All the guys started acting chaotically, which is why many got injured. The guy was shocked that the leader decided to confront such a huge monster. Mason actually took all the people back and came face to face with the keeper. His attacks were calm and fast, and he could cause significant damage with one dash. But the monster's wounds healed quickly due to the power of restoration. It was time to change teams and prepare for the explosion. Zane approached Carl, suggesting that they needed to intervene as well. Our hero nodded his head and simply walked forward. Marvin screamed in confusion and started trying to stop him. At that very moment, a huge sword flew towards him. But Carl's agility was too high, so he easily dodged it. Our hero's guesses turned out to be correct. But the rest didn't know this yet, simply because they had recently completed their studies. This monster, although bloodthirsty, moved like ordinary orcs. The difference was in the appearance and its regeneration, which means the attack pattern is clear. Continuing to dodge, the guy decided to check something. With this opponent, he could test the powers of the new ego with which he had established contact. Literally in the blink of an eye, a flurry of lightning strikes erupted. Carl was wearing Hermes sneakers, which were the reason for his incredible speed. The maximum speed was accumulated over 5 minutes. In any case, due to the number of blows, the monster was unable to recover normally. Mason still shouted, saying that the monster has regeneration, so it's all useless. He continued to give various pieces of advice, but suddenly fell silent. The leader realized that the keeper was defeated, because the regeneration had simply stopped. This is already the work of another ego, which accelerated the process of restoring magical powers. The keeper suddenly jumped up and began waving his arms aggressively. Players didn't understand what was wrong with the monster and why it was changing tactics, but it was more like a cornered monster that was resisting. Our hero instantly jumped into the air because he had foreseen all this. Once again, he ran past the giant with lightning speed and dealt fatal blows. But Carl didn't stop with the attacks, he even liked it. At that moment, the giant felt too ill. All that was left was to make a wide swing and cut the keeper horizontally. Even despite the monster's appearance, it was not scary for Carl. Even at his level, he was still the same stupid orc. The time has come for the final blow. Soon, all the raid participants were standing with their mouths open. At that moment, our hero stood over the defeated guardian of the fourth floor. People started whispering about the guy that he killed such a monster single-handedly, and the system reported that he had destroyed a lower demon, which was surprising. Shortly after, the cannibalism skill was activated. Before the eyes of all the players, the giant began to evaporate. He was supposed to turn into an ego, but for some reason the transformation was stopped. The particles miraculously penetrated Lou, who looked slyly at the owner. One way or another, the giant simply disappeared from the battlefield. Mason, although in shock, ordered that the wounded be taken care of. The boys had to stay focused and hold their swords high. Shortly after, Mason asked to speak with player Carl alone. Our hero assumed that he would be interrogated because of the disappearance of the body. The keeper was of great value, but he left nothing behind at all. Carl should have been held accountable for this, but there was no evidence of guilt. It could all be put down to the fact that the monster was already unusual, and yet suddenly Mason simply offered to join his guild. The guy sighed because all his fears were not confirmed. Either way, he didn't want to join the guilds. He was only here to participate. Mason was upset because he didn't want to lose such a powerful player. But in any case, he suggested maintaining good relations between themselves. The guy handed over a business card that he could use to call if necessary. After some time, the raiders returned back to the association. Carl turned to Zane because he wanted to ask something. He wanted to know why the guys didn't join Gary's guild. The guy replied that there was no reason for that, even despite the victories. Zane didn't want to be seen as a weakling. He wanted to achieve everything on his own. But soon he asked Carl a counter question. He was sure that with his abilities, Gary had many offers. Our hero immediately became thoughtful. Suddenly, Emma and Marvin came up and suggested going to dinner. Carl immediately apologized because he had to move soon. So he said goodbye to the guys and headed home to pack his things. But he still promised that he would invite them to the housewarming party when he moved in. It was time to call the secretary soon because he asked to call him after the raid. True, when he picked up the phone, he saw a message from Davis. The man also asked to call him after the raid was over. After some time, they were already going up in the elevator. It turned out that the president of the association wanted to have dinner with Carl. All that was known was that this great man was hiding in the world of Korean players. But the question was urgent. What was the purpose of this meeting? It turned out they were heading straight to Davis's home. As he said, the president wanted to cook the dinner himself. It was his hobby. Only after entering did Davis notify the old man that they had arrived. The man was glad that they arrived on time. Davis and the president communicated too easily. Our hero looked around the corner and fell silent. When he saw the man, he was surprised to find that it was the president of the Korean Players Association. Soon he extended his hand and decided to meet the player Carl. The guys greeted each other awkwardly. Our hero wanted to say something, but suddenly he froze. There was too much pressure coming from the president when he introduced himself. This meant that not everyone could be the head of the superhumans. However, Davis asked his father to stop being silly, since they were meeting for the first time. Hearing the word father, our hero fell into a stupor. One way or another, the boys were soon getting ready to sit down to dinner. Suddenly, the man said that he had heard a lot about Carl from Davis. For example, the fact that he helped him a lot, taking advantage of his position as boss. Our hero even stopped chewing at that moment. Davis intervened, asking him to stop carrying a silly aura while eating. Anyway, the man sighed and said he had one suggestion. The guy swallowed the food with difficulty and asked what they were talking about. The president wanted to hire him to work for the association. Of course, Carl repeated the same thing that Davis said, but that was far from what was being discussed. The man offered him to become a mercenary. Soon, our hero was thinking about what had happened. The president allowed to receive assistance from the association and provide the necessary things. It was a part-time position with a lot of benefits, which was pretty good. And yet suddenly our hero thought about Zane's question. But Gary had already become the head of a guild that could be counted on one hand. In turn, our hero was at the first level and was only receiving help. He didn't want to be a debtor. He was more interested in standing firmly on his own feet. It only meant that they would see Gary again in the tower. Just at this time, a battle was taking place on one of the floors. The magician and the swordsman expected to meet a monster. A moment later, a flaming saber-toothed tiger jumped out at them. The swordsman was capable, so he managed to react and cut it. Fortunately, it was possible to leave quietly. but the swordsman suggested killing a couple more. But suddenly they were overcome by an incomprehensible cold. It should have been warm on the 26th floor, but the situation was different. Looking back, the boys noticed the foot of the hill. A moment later, the magician screamed in bewilderment. All around they saw a bunch of monsters covered in ice. Moreover, a huge area was completely covered in ice. Naturally, this was all Gary's doing. His guild couldn't find anything useful, so they moved on. Soon, there were news from everywhere that the Angela had taken over the 80th floor. South Korea was the leading power in terms of good players. The presenters even prepared a top list of the best players of the week. The first of them was a living legend, the fierce Assura. However, little was known about him, for he hid in the darkness. It turns out that this same Assura is the president of the Players Association and Davis's father. In that case, it could be considered that Davis had no other choice but to become like his father. And yet he preferred to keep it all a secret. Suddenly he held out the ring and asked me to take it. Carl was scared because he thought it was a marriage proposal. But in fact, this is the identity card of all mercenaries with their powers. Joshua was supposed to help with everything else. All the privileges and rewards that apply to top rankers will now apply to him. The number of bonuses was so huge that Carl was completely left to load. At this time, the office of the Iron Guild was in a state of unrest. A guy came into Thomas's office to deliver something. It turned out that Rogers was alive. He was resurrected. Of course, he didn't feel as good as before, but still. The guy came to the head with a proposal. He dreamed of going to Korea to take revenge. To Rogers' surprise, the head gave him the go-ahead, because they would be opening a branch there. Now he was the head of the Korean branch, and he could do whatever he wanted. Moreover, Thomas promised to give him the sacred sword Nain. Rogers' gratitude to the chief knew no bounds. Thomas had a plan in which this guy would become his trump card for revenge, and the next time he meets the Demon King, he will destroy her. At this time, our hero was studying Ellie's improvements, and it was necessary to deal with them. The guy approached her, asking where he could get a sword. But she didn't know this either. She didn't remember everything yet. In that case, the question passed like a baton to Lou. The fate of the fragments he had retrieved from the keepers was still of interest. Our hero wanted to know if anything had changed. But suddenly Joshua intervened in the conversation and brought up a neutral topic. The boys assumed that he could hear them, although this was impossible. And yet Lou had no idea about the fragments. In that case, the only thing left to do was to ask where they were going. It was a certain Yosu Gate, rank between F and C, a normal quest. Carl was a little worried because this was his first job as a mercenary. And what's more, the first goal was reconnaissance, which Joshua would also go for. Suddenly, the secretary said that everyone in the association had code names. This morning, we decided what name to give him. The guy was anticipating something interesting and brutal, but he was given the name Morningstar, by the way. It turned out to be an interesting coincidence with Zane. One way or another, the road led them to the gate. Before the mission, our hero decided to have a hearty snack. They were officially greeted by the head of the Yeosu City Association. And also, our hero asked not to call him the Morningstar. In any case, the conversation turned to the gates discovered 4 days ago. They were special, which meant that no one else had been there before. This only confirmed that they were in for a routine reconnaissance mission. Regarding the military forces, they could have been provided with a B-rank squad. The man also said that all the equipment had been prepared for them. They could have started, but at that moment something distracted them. The boys noticed Carl walking towards the gate. Because of his condition, he was very dangerous, so they wanted to stop him. Only now they all said in one voice that they were confident in their thoughts. Our hero trusted them as himself and therefore decided to touch them. A moment later, the gate began to emit a bright red light. This only meant the gates were broken. The guys started calling the main office and asking for help from the nearest guilds. But our hero was delighted, because it was something new. It turns out that the gate is the ego. The guy immediately connected. Only at the very last moment did Joseph manage to snatch Carl. A strange, brotherly atmosphere hung between them. One way or another, he was soon scolding the player for his stupidity. He could smash the gates and release all the monsters. Carl really couldn't have imagined that everything would turn out like this. Still, he wondered what could have gone wrong. At the moment, the gates have returned to normal. One way or another, Joseph soon said something incomprehensible. When I picked it up, it turned out to be a paper mask. And near the gates, a huge group of people who had been called had already gathered. Our hero became a real news hero, which is why he had to hide. And yet, after the meeting, it was decided that Carl would go inside alone. There were objections from the outside, but the association did everything for our hero. Joseph wanted to be sure that the guy could handle it alone. Our hero was too strong and believed in it, so he set out on his journey. After a while, the guy was inside. There was a rather uneasy feeling in that place, as if he was being watched. The guy decided to get rid of all the monsters at once to be safe. But there was no need to go, because an army was running towards them. A whole bunch of skeletons ran after our hero, wishing him death. It turned out that the leader was Dullahan, the headless horseman. It was quite strange because such monsters attacked right away. In any case, our hero took out his blades and made a high-speed dash. The skeletons fell apart like nuts. A moment later, our hero soared into the air, attacking the leader. Soon a skirmish broke out between the player and the monster. After some time, our hero came to the cemetery, but everything here was strange. Lou was nervous because there weren't many skeletons to attack. Compared to the gate's aura, this power was simply not enough. Carl agreed with this because the place seemed much weaker. But there was still something hidden. Since there was a moment of meeting with the boss, something terrible could happen. Lou was sure that there was a reason for Dullahan's weakness, so he had to be careful. Our hero raised his sword as the coffin slowly began to open. A monster emerged from there. All the magical power was concentrated directly in it. It was a truly terrifying monster to be feared. This guy appeared at the top-level gate, or after the 60th floor of the tower. This monster was the king of the immortals, the lich. Suddenly, the dead man asked the player if he really wanted to become his master. These words took our hero by surprise. He didn't understand what it meant, but the monster kept asking this question. The main thing Carl noticed was that the voice of the system was coming from the keeper. The guy, without thinking twice, declared that he had come to become the master of these gates. There was something strange about this monster, because he began to think for a long time. Soon he himself said that he was the master. Carl immediately noticed that it was a human voice. In any case, it was worth starting to act first. Only the ghost immediately used the weapon and fired a projectile. It was too late to dodge, causing a huge explosion. Soon after, another attack of hundreds of magic arrows followed. Our hero could have died, but thanks to Hermes he made a speedy dash. Only the arrows seemed to be on target and continued to follow. Literally one wrong move and Carl could have died. It was necessary to act quickly and ambiguously. Our hero decided to throw Lou and use it as a springboard. In the blink of an eye, he was in the air and flying towards the monster. The gate owner believed that the pathetic guy wouldn't be able to even scratch him. However, using his agility, Carl delivered a powerful blow. Of course, this only made the monster angry. At that very moment, he decided that there was no point in delaying with the pathetic man. A few seconds later, an unimaginable number of arrows were flying over our hero. Luckily, Ellie could help with this and asked her owner to use her. Lou also wanted to help, but he was not fit for this action. And still, looking at the monster, there was a realization that he was only getting stronger. Carl suddenly changed his mind and asked Lou if he was confident in his abilities. The blade immediately responded that it was sure. Since our hero trusted his ego, he decided to take a desperate step. Lou began to absorb the energy of the magic weapon. Within a moment, the consciousness of the master of the magical weapon began to awaken within him. Now, for full activation, it remained to make a sacrifice for awakening. A moment later, there was a huge explosion. The gatekeeper had no idea what was going on. In any case, he had no intention of recognizing the man as the master. Soon he decided to begin his final test. Hordes of zombies began to emerge from the ground. A few moments later, the giant stood on a pillar of living dead. Our hero was in shock, but there was no time for questions. Right now, I had to fight a flesh golem. Without thinking twice, the giant went on the attack. It was only thanks to his agility that the boy jumped onto the monster's hand. Having cut the golem's hand, Carl headed towards the keeper. After a severe injury, the gates finally accepted their new owner. Now all that remained was to give it a name. At about the same moment, Lou began to make himself known. The sword began to scream and was proud that he did it. He was confident that he was getting stronger, which made him more brazen than usual. Our hero tried to understand what was happening, but there was no answer. Suddenly, Ellie told her owner that he was confused. Suddenly, the blade returned to its form and decided to rest. Carl had a lot of questions for Ego, but they could discuss it later. It's time again to think about a name for the new Ego. Our hero decided to pay homage to Brunheart, and so he named his new companion after him. The action moves to the real world, where the situation was not the most pleasant. There were warnings all around about the gates breaking. All employees of the association were called to take shelter. Meanwhile, an army of players guarded the gates. For some, this was the first time, and the ranks were low. Suddenly, a shocked guy started getting out of the car. It turned out that it was Davis, who had come to control the situation. Meanwhile, the evacuation proceeded without problems and will soon be over. True, Davis ordered that everything should be completed in 10 minutes. Well, the main problem was the journalists who remained in their places. Davis decided that they could stay if they wanted to die. The man himself understood that breaking the gates in itself was not a problem, considering all the players. He was most worried about Carl because something could happen to him. A moment later, the gate began to indicate that there would be a rupture. All the players began to prepare for battle, expecting the worst. But Davis was the one who worried the most, or rather blamed himself. He decided that he had to do everything himself. Jumping forward, he decided that he would kill all of Carl's enemies with his own hands. He flew and shouted the name of his spiritual son. However, suddenly the guy's voice stopped him. Since he was in flight, he couldn't stop, but he looked after him with bewilderment. A moment later, Davis landed and the gate closed completely. The guy turned his head trying to find out what happened. At that very moment, all the journalists began to blind him with their flashes. Each of them wanted to take a tidbit for an interview and find out everything about their hero. After some time, they were home and telling everything to the president of the association. The man couldn't believe that all this was true, but now he understood Carl's secret. Davis suddenly asked what happened after connecting to the gate. The egos were in the process of stabilizing and did not respond, but it seemed as if the guy had lost something altogether. The man had heard about Lou, so he asked what was wrong with the timid guy. The guy told everything as it really is, ending by saying that there are no problems. Assura decided that the whole story with the gate owner would be a shock to everyone, but he will take all measures to ensure that everything does not end up on the web so early. Right during dinner, Carl received a call from his mobile phone. It turned out that it was my sister. The guy began to say goodbye to her, saying that he was now having an important conversation. True, he didn't have time to finish speaking because Mary said that he was on TV. The girl laughed at his strange mask, but she recognized him by the chain and rings. At that moment, the guys at the table also received messages on their phones. While Carl was in shock, Mary continued to admire her brother. She even wanted to brag to her friends, but the guy no longer listened to her. Looking around the corner, he noticed all these bewildered and desperate faces. Of course, it was true. Carl was in all the popular newspapers. At this time, the girl was sitting and reading the news until she was distracted by a question. Ava suddenly said that she undoubtedly had a very good student. The players' paparazzi were usually retired people, collecting hype material. Davis even apologized for not being able to prevent it all. While they were cleaning out the obvious reporters, one annoying guy crawled under them. Naturally, Carl asked who they were talking about. It turns out he was one of the best among the rankers, Michael. But Davis warned that it was very dangerous to contact him. The action soon moves to Grandpa Jack's workshop. Lou was losing his head at that time. The new ego only brought bad habits. Our hero assumed that this is exactly how he would speak to them. Carl felt a little lonely without Lou, and Ellie didn't even know what to say. Jack suddenly distracted the guy and asked what he was muttering. In any case, he added that he saw an article about a new celebrity. By the way, these two artifacts have started to be in demand. Our hero suddenly said that he needed something for camouflage. Jack immediately upset me by saying that he simply didn't have anything like that. But Carl needed something more effective than a mask. And now everyone knew about the ego. Carl was going to hide the rings from prying eyes. The man sighed and immediately pointed to the shelf with gloves and mittens. He just recently made several types. At this point, Carl became stronger because he could establish connections more easily. As Ellie said, it was all thanks to Carl's aura, which was growing. Well, as for choosing gloves, it was difficult because he couldn't choose something bright. Soon, one option really caught Carl's attention, and he took it. Even Jack, with a smile on his face, decided that this was a very good option. At that very moment, Carl gave the gloves the name Oberon, and everything went well. Our hero was able to establish a connection with these gloves as well. The sensation was strange, but he had to get used to it. This artifact could temporarily increase strength. But the main reason for the ego is the availability of rings, so it was time to check. The guy instantly summoned both swords, which meant everything worked as it should. Jack even froze in surprise because he had never seen this weapon before. Carl was happy with the purchase, but he still had to buy a new one. Suddenly, the grandfather said that the guy might not have to pay for the artifact. In return, he asked for help when Carl needed him. The very next day, our hero came to work at the association. But he really couldn't get there, because a huge crowd was standing right under the windows of the building. Joseph was shocked by these journalists, which gave him a headache. These guys come every day because of that masked ranker. Our hero assumed that they simply wouldn't climb up to the tower. Well, Joseph really made me happy and upset, reminding me of something. Carl is a lower ranker, so they need to go down, but the reporters consider the player to be a higher ranker. To take his mind off things a bit, our hero decided to go to the tower to hunt. He kept thinking about the blacksmith's words, because he always valued his weapons by setting a price for them. Presumably, the urgent request could be very serious. Suddenly, an unknown voice from behind addressed its owner. Carl looked around in confusion and turned to Ellie when he saw no one. The voice asked him to call him by name, but Carl did not understand what was happening. The voice itself was different, so it's not even banal Lou. Our hero soon called out the name Brunheart, and a sphere appeared in the sky. He had encountered this somewhere before. Only after remembering the nightmare in the forest did the guy begin to close his clothes. But nothing happened. The system asked the owner to choose a form for Brunheart. Ellie added that you need to touch and imagine the desired image. All this time our hero was thinking about Brunheart. They didn't spend much time together, but he became a savior. That's why Carl wanted him to never leave him. Suddenly, the sphere began to be absorbed into the man's body. The sensations were similar to those of Iron Man. Within moments, a new and joyful voice spoke. Ego was glad to be with his master again, and that meant only one thing. It was an artifact that took over memory, which means it was the real Brunheart. Brunheart's happiness knew no bounds. But Carl imagined Brunheart a little differently, not an ego with a childish voice. Either way, it's time for a merger. The fusion with the body was the result of Carl's wishes. He was able to take over the memories and reflection skill that Brunheart had. But that was not all. Now this ego had gate skills too. Thus our hero climbed the tower and assessed his egos. The guy could now close and open the gates but without the ability to enter. But it was a useful skill, as it allowed the gate to be torn apart. But if Carl could control the gate, his power would be beyond measure. The next item was management and acquisitions related to Brunheart's growth. Well, to begin with, it was necessary to deal with the giant Smilodon. All week Carl caught weak monsters and it was time for the strong ones. Using force, the boy stopped the monster's attack. A moment later, he launched a series of aggressive punches and angered his opponent. The monster tried to attack the enemy somehow, but our hero had a card up his sleeve, namely a reflection. A moment later, there was a huge surge of energy. This keeper, like all the previous ones, calmly passed away to the next world. For this, our hero even decided to feed Brunheart. In the end, all that was left of the trophies was a green crystal and no other equipment. And still, you could get something nice out of it. Anyway, he decided to do something different. The guy suddenly opened the gate. A moment later, he threw a stone there, because he had learned something. The gate gains experience points, and the monsters inside the gate have already become stronger. With the help of crystals, they grew, and their skills became stronger. Our hero set a goal for himself to go to the 30th floor. There was a sudden minor skirmish on the 29th floor. The red players communicated with ill-wishers and were rude to them. The guys clearly had a disagreement about something and decided to prove whose guild was stronger. Our hero was able to hear the sounds of blows and understand that a battle between players was underway. With a wave of his hand, he decided that noble people should not interfere in the showdown. At this time, the guys were clearly losing the battle to the red players. The Kane Guild representative asked how they dared to touch them. The guy laughed, saying that they were all losers and he wanted to see the guild leader. First, he ordered that Gary be called in to talk to him. A moment later, the guy regretted what he said. Our hero trampled him into the ground and asked what he was carrying. There was no answer as he squeezed harder and harder. At some point, there was a loud crunch and silence. After picking this guy up, Carl decided that he should calm down. And immediately he realized that he had already seen this impudent bully. But there was no particular understanding of why the Smurf Guild was doing this to Kane. Our hero felt that he needed to calm down, but anger permeated him. The guild rushed to attack to avenge their friend. Our hero instantly swung his blades. Carl killed a man for the first time and did not hesitate at all when he swung his blade. The sensations were incomprehensible, and his heart did not stop beating wildly. Our hero continued to mercilessly cut down his opponents. He no longer looked like a human, but rather like a bloodthirsty animal. But Ellie was still able to reach the owner and stop him. Soon, the guild representative Kane met Carl. He also added that Gary had spoken about him and would like to accept him into the guild. To himself, he thought that Carl was called a soft-bodied weakling. But remembering his movements and strength, not inferior to the head, it was scary. Carl asked anyway what was wrong with the Smurf Guild. In fact, they themselves didn't know because Gary is not one to make enemies. They were going to interrogate them, and if necessary, just get rid of them. The word torture was truly frightening for Carl. Soon the guy left and left the guilds to sort things out alone. He himself began to sort things out in his head. During the raid, he couldn't control himself and thought that these were consequences. But now the word torture didn't awaken a drop of interest in him. He couldn't understand the reason why he was able to control his anger that time. And even more important was to find out why he was happy killing people. The guy immediately apologized to his ego for making him worry. He assumed that this was all the work of the Demon King, due to her strange actions. Suddenly, he returned to the guys who were already torturing the Guild of Offenders. It turned out that these guys were simply following the boss's orders. These were the lower members of the guild, who knew nothing and could do nothing. Soon they decided to say goodbye, because they had other things to do. Only then our hero suddenly felt a strange feeling behind him. In just a few moments, a huge army of the Smurf Guild stood on the field. The situation was dangerous, but Carl didn't even flinch. The guy suddenly said that they had sent a report, but there was no need to expect reinforcements. Our hero sighed and said that he would clear the way, but they needed a messenger. The guy was too excited in anticipation of the battle. Once again, a hail of lightning attacks rained down on all opponents. He carried out unimaginable series of attacks, both in the air and on the ground. The Cain Guild watched in shock, and yet they all decided to help, so they went into battle. Our hero enjoyed the battle because it was no different from slaughtering monsters. Suddenly, his mad face turned red. Moreover, the entire battlefield was filled with fire. And of course, Carl was able to react and jump back. The source of evil was surprised that Carl was doing a good job of dodging. That madman was the fallen ranker, Lenny's killer. With his crazy smile, he decided to invite Carl to join their guild. These guys committed crimes inside the tower and called them Reds. The association could do nothing but watch the entrance to the tower. Former ranker Lenny is the founder of the Red Players. This guy was crazy to give up everything and choose the path of a criminal. He justified his status as a psychopath obsessed with murder. Lenny was sure that Carl was just like them, and he would like it with them. Our hero accepted these words in his head with horror. The truth is, he didn't want to consider himself a criminal. One of the participants screamed in bewilderment. He wanted to destroy Carl. Only a moment later, he was engulfed in the leader's flame. This man was the deputy leader, who was disposed of in a second. Lenny immediately apologized to the guest for the fact that there were ignoramuses among them. While they were removing the deputy, the leader suddenly said that they had a free place. The madman wanted to give the position directly to him. Our hero wanted to know why they were hunting the Cain Guild. Lenny was surprised that he asked a question, but there was nothing to hide. It turned out that the Red Players were going to leave the tower out of boredom. The guild representative did not understand how they felt about their desire. And yet, instead of answering, the smile on Lenny's face grew even wider. Our hero, perplexed, asked the guy how he knew about this. Gary's secret was his second special skill. Lenny was surprised that Carl also knew about this secret. But our hero decided that he should shut this bastard up. The madman immediately saw that same sparkle in his opponent's eyes. He started throwing flames, saying that Carl was the same. A fierce battle for survival soon began. Lenny decided to clarify who is in charge on the battlefield. A moment later, a huge explosion was heard. Our hero jumped to the side, but something was wrong. From such a light blow, he was able to sense someone else's presence. But Lenny had no intention of giving the enemy a rest, so he continued to advance. Carl was simply behind in speed despite his strength. Because of this, he didn't even have time to react and received a blow to the left side. The guy jumped back, not understanding why his opponent became faster. Ellie pointed out that the opponent's movement speed had not changed. It only meant that he had more than just one weapon. The enemy accumulated damage, and as soon as the battle dragged on, he won. Our hero immediately understood what and how to do. The guy instantly used acceleration and ran forward. Lenny liked it. He suddenly used all his powers to the maximum. Carl had to run through a fiery field. The heat was incredible, but it made his victory closer. Having crept up as close as possible, Carl used reflection. A moment later, there was an explosion much larger than it was. Soon the flames dispersed, and an unknown object flew past the guild. That object was the defeated Lenny, who was on the edge. His mistake was to reveal his own weaknesses. For such an unforgivable mistake, Carl simply absorbed the man's body. The activation condition was unclear, but he still became stronger. Carl's whole body was falling apart, but he must not show weakness. The guild was supposed to retreat due to the death of the leader, but they started whispering. The guys assumed that if these freaks at the head died, then they have a new boss. Of course, we were talking about Carl. Our hero understood that he had no strength and his skills were recharging. He needed at least a few minutes of rest. The guys looked and thought that they liked this guild leader. He had an incredibly dark aura, even though he wasn't even a red player. And yet, none of this matters when they have numerical superiority. They all rush to the attack, deciding to finish off Carl and take the place of the leader for themselves. Our hero was preparing for the worst, but a moment later, a smile appeared on his face. However, his salvation came in time. Gary flew in on his ice and froze the entire Smurf Guild. The Kane members were happy to see the leader, but the bad guys were horrified. Gary wanted to talk to Carl, but he had business to attend to right now. Using the snowstorm, he engulfed the entire battlefield in cold and wind. Suddenly, the guy started counting and looking around. Soon, he waved his blade and said he needed 3 minutes. A moment later, the guy rushed into battle like a bullet. He was no less bloodthirsty than Carl, rushing past the offenders. Our hero watched Gary, resting and realizing that he had become stronger. And yet, now it seemed to him that Gary was not so far away from him. Having drunk a powerful potion of restoration, our hero also went to cut up the freaks. Within a minute, the guys had finished off the entire guild. Now they could talk. There was a lot to discuss. The first thing that interested Gary was Carl's eyes. It turned out that his left eye had turned purple. Naturally, he realized that this was all Ava's doing. But he answered sheepishly that it was all because of skill. Gary also knew that the guy had changed not only in appearance, but had also become stronger. He couldn't even imagine that the same rancor in the mask was Carl. It turned out that Zane told him everything, and he guessed right away. Our hero felt easier and calmer with the mask. But the reporters, fortunately, managed to switch to something else. Our hero, of course, didn't know the latest news, so he was surprised. It turned out that the chairman of the Players Association showed his face for the first time. Carl immediately realized that he wanted to cover for him. And yet, it was time to say goodbye, because each of them still had a lot of things to do. Gary could only go out for a cup of coffee instead of beer. Suddenly, a mercenary ring appeared on his hand. It turns out that there are many mercenaries among them. But the most important thing is that not all mercenaries are friendly to each other. That's why Gary hides the ring, and our hero tries to do the same. And yet, in this case, an important question followed. Carl asked what Gary's code name was. The boy turned away embarrassedly and said that his name was Arock. Well, Carl really decided that this was much better than the Morning Star. And soon the girl said that she heard about the reason for the attack of the Smurf Guild. Our hero wanted to know how Gary was able to escape. But he already knew that his second skill was creating portals. This skill was independent of the tower and could stir up the whole world. That's why Gary was so careful to hide his ability. But still, how did the Smurf Guild find out about this then? Gary said that it was a long story and it was better to leave here quickly. The guys decided to go to a familiar cafe. A moment later, Davis was confused and said that he didn't have a cafe here. The guys came to his office with a desire to communicate in isolation. But Davis soon noticed Carl's eyes. He also said it was a skill, but he didn't know how long they would be like that. The man sighed, suddenly saying that the Smurf Guild had died. He assumed the boys had a request if they came here. Only Carl said that they didn't want anything from him. Davis was shocked that they came to use his soundproofing. It turns out that Gary recently had to create a portal in front of the bosses. Among them was one who was captured by the Smurfs. They got all the information out of this guy and wanted to get the skill. Davis sighed heavily and asked what had become of that leader. The prisoners knew nothing about him, so there was a possibility that he was alive. Davis decided that this pathetic guild needed to be completely destroyed. Gary said his entire guild was involved. There couldn't be any leaks. In the evening, the guys discussed everything and said goodbye. Gary seemed calm as he left to run his business. But the guys were sure that he was simply boiling inside. He treats his guild members like family. And yet, suddenly Davis asked how Carl was feeling. The guy told how he was cured, but the manager asked about his mental health. It was about killing a person, but it was not exactly the first time. In any case, he didn't regret it because that entire guild had to fall. Still, he admitted that he felt joy when he killed a man. Suddenly, Davis scratched Carl and said that it was not important. There were too many people with black souls in their business. The main thing was to control the darkness within. The action takes us to the next day, to the 29th floor. The guy saw frost everywhere, which meant Gary was present. Looking around, he was shocked that there had been a massacre here yesterday. Although the guy was not surprised by what happened, but his eye was worried about Carl, because perhaps he had changed too much, and yet it was time to go to the 30th floor. This meant that it was time for the next examination floor. The boy held out his hand, but it was shaking, perhaps warning him. The player could not ignore the premonitions, and his feelings became even sharper. And yet, the ego and its owner were going anywhere, so it was time to stop doubting. The door began to open, and the system immediately notified about the test. Soon Carl was walking across an unknown sandy field towards the castle. Suddenly, the earth began to tremble. A moment later, the guy was surrounded by dozens of huge scorpions. There was nowhere to go. All that was left was to fight. Our hero made a dash, but because of the sand, he simply lost his balance. Because of his mistake, he could have gotten into an unpleasant situation. However, by using his power, he was able to avoid this. A moment later, he rose into the air and delivered a powerful blow. Not the best conditions for walking, so it was worth walking right over their heads. Suddenly, Lu's voice leaked out, saying something incomprehensible. It turns out that he woke up as soon as they entered, but that was not the main thing. Even Lu directed his master towards the castle. Suddenly, he became silent and soon said that his body was inside. The guy wanted to know the details, but Lu suddenly fell silent. Still, the details were worth listening to later. There were a lot of monsters around. Soon he was using his sword as a footstool. A moment later, he made a deft dash towards the castle. I wanted to collect all the crystals, but still, there was no time now. The guy suddenly imagined that they had a new addition in the form of Brunheart. Ego began to greet Lu joyfully and speak to him with respect. They started chatting with each other and Carl realized that they liked each other. And yet, after just a few moments, the guy was standing in front of the entrance to the castle. He immediately rushed inside and began to look around. It was empty inside. Only 2 huge knights guarded the boss's room. Lu repeated again that his flesh was behind the door. By this time, our hero already clearly felt this himself. A moment later, both knights came to life and attacked Carl. Thanks to his speed, he dodged. But he didn't want to fight the golems. There was an option to just go inside, but it was impossible to leave enemies behind, especially when there was an incomprehensible body of Lu inside. These knights may have been strong, but each one had their own weak points. The guy attacked the monster's head, but he didn't care at all. A moment later, another monster attacked. This is what Carl couldn't reflect, which is why he flew to the side. The power was incredible, and his blow was like a baby's blow. It goes without saying that only one thing could work against such monsters. Our hero had to fend off the blows. In one moment, he reflected both of their weapons, and they destroyed themselves. One knight's head was cut off from his shoulders, and the other one lost his torso. Carl had been flying around the ground a lot lately, but he was a genius. Now they were back to the gates and the discussion of Lu's flesh. He explained that inside was the body he had when he was alive. It turns out that he was incredibly strong, and even in his dreams he could not be defeated. But still, it was only empty flesh and the soul was here. Inside sat a shell with Lu's memories, and at the same time it was incomplete. Our hero used all his potions and headed inside. Only when I opened my door did I hear a puzzled, sleepy voice. The monster was awakened and immediately began to emit a powerful aura. Carl had no idea who Lu was in his past life. Suddenly the monster said that this name was funny and did not belong to him. He shouted and introduced himself as the master of all demons and demonic swords. Before our hero stood the true demon king. Soon the monster called his name, but something seemed to prevent him from hearing it. Carl was puzzled that Lu was only giving out secrets during battles. And yet, the time has come to destroy the empty shell. Lu himself was angry, wanting to smash the monster to smithereens. The guy used a dash and ran up to the monster in an instant. The blow could have been powerful, but the shell calmly dodged the attack. Dozens more blade strikes followed. To the Demon King, these were all trifles, as if they passed right through him. But a moment later, a pile of blades hung over Carl. With a roar, they destroyed the place where the guy was standing, and he dodged. The monster was really strong because of the forehead there were problems. The shell suddenly praised the visitor for his good abilities. But still, it wouldn't help him leave even a scratch. Even though this monster was annoying, he was right. A wall of swords appeared in front of the shell without end. The demon decided to add some fun, so he created even more swords. This entire ghost army headed towards Carl. There was an explosion and there was no one in Carl's place. Our hero was already behind, but the monster was ready for this. The blades that appeared immediately began to attack Carl. Our hero had to retreat again. But there was no time to rest, because the next attack followed immediately. It looked like the guy was fighting several swordsmen. Suddenly he remembered the monster's words. From Lu's words, it also turned out that these were low-level demonic swords. But unfortunately, Lu simply couldn't absorb them as he did with Chelmont. Moreover, the blade could do nothing, because his flesh ruled here. Still, he could try to give Carl power because this place is special. This required a little more time, which was not easy at all. The guy experienced explosions and endless escape, waiting for success. Soon he came face to face with a pile of swords. There was nothing left to do except reflect. Suddenly there was an explosion and all the swords flew apart. Our hero thought that everything was behind him and he had coped. But in truth, after a couple of seconds, all the swords were in the same direction. Carl shouted at his companion saying that he could die. Suddenly, power began to flow into Carl's body. Now our hero could use Ego's abilities even more effectively. There was a huge explosion radiating energy. The shell stared at the guy in horror, not understanding where he got this power from. Lu taught the master about death and now he could control it. Soon our hero landed on the ground, standing in front of the shell. The guy's eyes were filled with rage. The monster had the same eyes, only now he was trembling with fear. In bewilderment, he shouted, declaring that this was his power. A veritable tornado of swords appeared in the air. The guy promised to tear Carl to shreds. A huge aura headed towards our hero. At that moment, the guy just raised the blade and looked into the eyes of death. It turned out that Brunheart managed to repel this attack. The monster lost his temper and continued to rage. Now it was a matter of honor for him to destroy the miserable man. The giant smashed the floor and the wall to pieces. He soon ran out of swords and was wounded, but he still had his strength. Lu decided to remind that he was very strong. All that was left was to fight with his own strength, otherwise Carl's body would not withstand it. Our hero repeated that once would be enough. At that very moment, he moved forward and began to attack the enemy. The demon could not tolerate the bullying, so he began to swing his sword. He didn't believe that a pathetic man could compete with him. But soon the pride disappeared from his face. He noticed that the man was missing one of his blades. At that very moment, the demonic blade greeted itself. Before he could even say a word, the shell received a powerful blow to the back. He couldn't believe what was happening, but soon he simply disappeared. The demon lord has been defeated. Time to rest. The guy had been waiting for this moment since the very beginning of the test. After starting to drink potions, system notifications appeared around. The test was completed perfectly, which resulted in a reward. A moment later, he was in the reward room. The guy gained several skills and raised the levels of the fusion skill. Now there was even too much information in the system. Having the ability to connect, he thought about how to connect Lu and Ellie. The ego began to complain in bewilderment, to which Carl assured them it was a joke. There was no way to check now, so it was time to open the awards. The guy received a gold and a diamond box, deciding to start with the gold one. Opening it, he saw 3 strange spheres. It turned out that these were 3 fragments of the ego that he had absorbed. He got something similar for clearing the gates, but it's unclear what they were doing here. And yet, it was time to get down to the tasty morsel. He was anticipating something unusual. Suddenly, he saw strange bones inside. Lu suddenly started acting strangely. He assumed it was a cruel joke. The reason he was worried was that it was part of his real flesh. The action moves to the association's cafe on the 30th floor. Our hero sat opposite his blade, waiting to hear the whole story. The guy asked Lu directly who he was. He repeated the words of his flesh that he was the king of all demons. They were looking forward to hearing how the demon king became a sword. Lu suddenly said that in order to exist forever, he needed oblivion. He had to forget everything, even his time. Otherwise, his essence would go into the trash. The traitors imprisoned him, and he was forced to languish for eternity. Lu decided to simply forget about his feelings, his purpose, his name, and even his own self. When he awakened as a swordmaster, he was able to remember part of it. And yet, he simply could not decide what he should do. And then he chose to forget everything again. In the end, Carl couldn't find out much. He didn't want to see him suffer, so he decided not to ask him. From now on, it was necessary to create new memories and forget the past. Our hero was heading home to rest. At this time, Davis, without leaving his office, sat at work. A puzzled Joseph distracted him from his work. The man, without being distracted, praised the boy and sent him home. It's true that Joseph came for the same reason, to take away the eternally working boss. But Davis was too eager to end the Smurf Guild incident. He even went so far as to apply magic to office work. Davis suddenly said that tomorrow he has a meeting with Lily, or rather a housewarming party at Carl's. The next day, our hero met his bewildered friends. They stood in front of a luxurious villa. The guys entered the territory and looked around. As soon as they entered, they were met by their mother and Mary. All the guys started getting to know each other and introducing themselves. Suddenly, they all froze as soon as they found out that this girl was Carl's mother. Looking at her, they perceived her as a younger sister. Suddenly, Mary turned to her brother and asked if Davis was coming. The guy assumed that she was bored, but she wanted an autograph. He smiled and said that maybe he could distract him from his work and get it. But for now, he decided to go outside, and she needed to help her mother. Davis and Joseph were standing in front of the house. Our hero was glad to see them. The secretary suddenly apologized, saying that he had forgotten about the gift because of work. But Carl said that finding this house was already a very worthwhile gift. But it turns out that Davis bought all the furniture for the house. But the old furniture was still in good condition, so it wasn't worth it. Suddenly, Carl asked Davis if he had bought it with the hope of moving in with them. The man blushed and did not understand what was being discussed. And yet, at home, he was already melting in mercy and kindness before Lily. It was already evening, after a delicious dinner, time to finish. Everyone was busy with their own affairs and communicating. Suddenly, Carl intercepted Davis. He suggested going outside for a while and talking. On the street, he decided to tell what was still a secret, but he trusted Carl. He stated that the Iron Guild has decided to open a branch in Korea. Everyone was against it, but Angela intervened, possibly due to an agreement. Unfortunately, even they couldn't ignore this guild, but they tried. It was precisely because of this that they had to reveal the identity of the head of the association. After this information, Davis turned around and walked back into the house. Our hero, meanwhile, was incredibly angry, and the action moves to the branch of the Iron Guild. Rogers was already dreaming about how he would deal with Carl. During this period, he became even more maddened by his thirst for revenge. And yet, thanks to the new sword, he was confident of his victory. At this time, our heroes had finished their housewarming party and were heading home. Carl soon went to the basement, thinking about the Iron Guild. He quickly learned that Rogers would be the director and that the term would be 3 months. The chance to take revenge appeared much faster. A moment later, he walked inside. The place was perfect for training. Our hero was going to test the opening of the gate. Sitting down on the chair, he again began to think about the guild and the plan of destruction. He had to know himself by heart and learn all the incomprehensible skills. After pronouncing the name of the skill, the system required choosing the main ego. Without thinking twice, our hero chose LU. Within a moment, the merging began to happen. Energy was coming from everywhere. A couple of seconds later, a huge wolf hung in the air. But in fact, it turned out that this was the story of a perplexed Lu. Our hero declared that it was a joke, and yet he thought about how to understand this system. The ego with consciousness was dangerous to use, and others help him well. In that case, the only thing left was to use the ego fragments. Suddenly, Brunheart announced that he wanted to try. He wanted to become stronger and help, even without knowing the result. Although he was worried, he felt that everything would be fine. By choosing Brunheart, our hero added a fragment of ego. The merger began almost immediately. Within a few seconds, Brunheart began to feel unwell. Carl started to panic and try to disable the merge. But in truth, a moment later the system transferred them to the gate. It turned out that they returned to that very cemetery. The system stated that the ego fragment could now influence Brunheart. It remained to be seen how to do this. Our hero soon noticed a coffin from which a glow emanated. Before opening, the system stopped the player and began to explain. A new gate manager needed to be created. Not knowing of a more powerful monster than the lich, our hero named him. Soon a monster appeared on the surface. He will be the new manager. He knelt down and began to greet the owner. Carl suggested that he could control monsters and listen to his orders. But there was no point in rushing, because everything was not quite like that. Having shown the system, it turned out that the gate level was small. They had to destroy the monsters in the gate area. Just at that moment, some guys showed up who needed to be beaten up to make them obey. If Carl has already cleared this gate, he will easily do it in the second one. Our hero rushed into battle with lightning speed and hung over the zombie army. At this time, people gathered near the house looking for Carl. It turns out that he hadn't been in touch for 3 days, which was normal. Mom assumed that something terrible had happened to him. Joseph was conducting an investigation into the basement. Our hero ordered no one to go inside. But that's what they decided to do and soon found themselves standing in an empty basement. Davis saw absolutely no clues. He wanted to say that this was absurd because a person could not disappear. The man started talking about strange gates, and just then they appeared. The boys cried out in bewilderment. Only Davis was terrified of the magical power, and our hero just came out of there thinking that he wanted to eat. Noticing his acquaintances, the guy asked in bewilderment what they were doing there. The guys began to randomly tell their stories and ask questions. This could make your head explode, so you had to speak alone. Carl calmed him down and said that he had to call them, and he also had a request. Davis grabbed the boy by the ear, telling him to tell him everything that happened. The guy admitted that he had established a connection with the gate and had come there. The boys instantly froze when they found out that he could control the gate. This meant that he could control monsters and stop them at will. It turns out that it is the same as if he could stop the disaster. Davis wanted to make sure no one but them knew about it. Carl admitted that he was just getting acquainted and trying his hand. And indeed, it would be better to keep it a secret. Suddenly, our hero returned to the request and asked Davis to fight him. Our hero wanted to test the power he had recently received. He also said that he would arrange dinner for him with his mother. Davis could not refuse his dear student in such a case. Our hero increased his gate control level to the 100th in 3 days. Because of the crystal, the gate was stronger, but not by much. He named Lich's manager Hart in honor of Brunheart. Carl wanted to name him Bruno, but all three of them rejected it. The next day, our heroes finally met at training. Carl immediately decided to start with the release of magical power. He could do this to hide his strength. In a moment, all the magical power began to flow out of the body. Davis was very glad that he hadn't imagined it yesterday. Taking his weapon in hand, he decided that he too would not hold back. Soon, the walls throughout the office began to shake. Those who knew immediately realized that it was the director training. There was indeed a fierce battle at this time. Our heroes fought with all their might. The guys in the office thought that everything would be fine. Magic won't be able to penetrate them, let alone vibrations. Of course, unless the director makes an effort and destroys everything. Our hero continued to attack the director, but experience allowed Davis to beat his opponents. He deftly knocked the guy over and pinned him to the ground. In just a moment, he was about to end the battle. Only Carl managed to use reflection and an explosion occurred. At this time, the guild also felt this shaking. The woman said that this was a clash of great magical forces. They assumed it was something nearby. The woman was sure that this was the work of the higher rankers. These guys usually fought face to face, just like our heroes. Davis continued to kick his student all over the field. Ego also tried to stop Carl, but Lou insisted that fighting would help him become stronger. Even Davis was getting tired of saying that Carl was not bad, and yet the guy was not going to stop, so he went on the attack. But Davis had anticipated the jump and was already behind. This was not a simple ranker, but a top ranker behemoth. The reason why it was called this weapon, Ship Behemoth. Carl immediately told Lou to use their plan. He suddenly released all his power. It was this explosion that released all the energy even into the office. Soon a puzzled Joseph entered the room. Davis immediately asked the secretary to bring some potions. Only the guy was perplexed by what happened in this room. And yet our hero also asked for the elixir. Davis poured medicine on himself, but his wounds did not heal. Carl decided that there was some kind of aggravation of wounds and it affected him. Joseph, in turn, still wanted to know what happened here. Looking around, he assumed that they were testing a nuclear bomb here. Our hero suddenly decided to ask Davis how he was enjoying the battle. He called the guy strong, but he was far from it, because his movements were ordinary. Carl could destroy 100 weak enemies, but he had problems with one strong one. It was necessary to understand the enemy, and then make sure that they did not understand him. But nowhere was it possible to master the technique as in a real battle. Strength without technique gives only half of the total power. And yet, the guy was able to leave a scratch on a legendary rank weapon. If Carl can master all this power and learn to control it, then he will be a god. Suddenly, Davis announced that he needed to apply for a ranker. This meant that they would know him by sight, but they agreed on something else. Still, there was no need to worry about revealing one's identity. Carl was a mercenary, and their protection comes first. In any case, he was able to reach the level to protect himself. Carl immediately blushed and everyone decided that he was shy. Still, he wanted to reduce the risks, so being a mercenary was enough. Davis sighed and handed over all duties to Joseph. Soon they went their separate ways. Already in the car, the secretary talked about the advantages of becoming a ranker. Roughly speaking, he could use everything he did through them on his own. It was all complicated, but mercenaries have the same rights as the boss. But there was something else more important, which had been discussed earlier as a secondary matter. The rankers had authority that was recognized throughout the world. This sounds very profitable because mercenaries are only powerful within the country. The guy suggested that this was too much coverage. Joseph was confident that Carl would soon appear on the international stage. Having decided that it was important, the guy decided to agree to become some kind of ranker. Joseph was shocked by the words some. A dubious quarrel began, which turned into a joke. However, there was one unpleasant situation for the rankers. Before becoming a ranker, Carl had to participate in a closed ranker battle. He must fight one of the 3 rankers to join their ranks. Joseph assured that this is a normal formality that newcomers participate in. The action moves to the 45th floor of the tower. A huge hound ran towards the people. A moment later, the girl straddled him, telling him about the monster's weaknesses. To defeat the monster, you had to climb on its head and strike it in the eyes. You can then destroy it with a blow to the inside of the knees. But the most important thing was to be strong enough. With these indicators, the monster will fall without problems. By the way, this girl was the leader of the Kacham Guild, Shay. All the guild members were delighted with the girl. Soon they were at their storage lockers. The woman approached Shay, offering to transfer the guild to another. The girl replied that she loved this business more than leveling up. Suddenly, she noticed an announcement about a closed ranker battle. Grandma immediately explained what it was, deciding that someone had been chosen as a ranker. This meant that he joined through connections and disappointed all the younger players. Looking at Carl, she decided that she would not give him this title so easily. The closed battle was witnessed by the headmaster, the director, and Gary. Our hero still understood that this was pure nepotism. He wanted the association to be fair. Joseph could offer no advice other than to resign himself and accept the advantages. Carl's opponent should have been worried. It was Shay who was the main one who wanted to defend the title. Joseph revealed that she is the head of a guild that consists entirely of girls. The guy thought that he had seen her somewhere before. After some time, the action moves to the training area. Joseph explained the rules of this competition, saying that it is serious. The headmaster, the director, and Gary supported Carl, causing him to blush again. But Shay only made sure that he got through thanks to connections. Raising her blade, she knew Carl was not qualified. In an instant, the battle of the rankers began. The boys clashed with their blades. Shay was incredibly angry and kept attacking non-stop. Suddenly, she was able to end up behind. The blow to the back was not long in coming, but Carl dodged it. All that was left was to restrain my strength and speed to the maximum. Our hero tried to work only with technology. And yet, one could not help but notice that the enemy was quite strong. And again, she continued to advance when she saw that Carl was standing. Our hero did everything smoothly and clearly, dodging attacks. Gary was shocked at how calm everything was, and Davis was also puzzled. These two moved superbly. At this point, Shay began to realize that she had jumped to conclusions. Even though the guy had connections, she couldn't get to him. She didn't want to use her skills, but there was no other way. At the same moment, a whirlwind of flaps began to fly towards Carl. Our hero literally did not see the sword, which means it was a hallucination. Lou couldn't contain himself anymore at that point, which meant it was time to finish. Our hero used the acceleration and in a moment stood face to face. The girl didn't even have time to come to her senses before she received a powerful blow to the chest. At that very second, her blade flew out of her hand. This only meant that the girl accepted a technical defeat. Joseph proudly announced that he had won Carl and became a ranker without any additional fights. Shay was disappointed by such a disgrace and did not know how to lift her head. Nevertheless, a hand reached out to her. Our hero thanked her for the duel, suddenly saying that they had not seen each other for a long time. The girl, perplexed, asked how he knew her. It turns out that Carl knew the girl's father. He was a guide, and the man often talked about her. Initially, Carl was skeptical, but after meeting him in person, there were no more doubts. The girl's father constantly spoke well of him as a very kind person. The girl immediately remembered all the stupid things she had been thinking about. But looking at that very guide from the stories, she didn't even say a word. Shay instantly blushed and held out her hand. Nevertheless, the judges soon congratulated Carl on becoming a ranker. Soon Joseph came over and it was necessary to sign. While the boys were busy with their own affairs, the girl called out to them. Being just as red, she asked for a phone number. Carl immediately reached into his pocket, because he was even glad to make an acquaintance. Only behind him he felt Joseph's intense gaze. And yet, soon the guy was going up in the elevator, with no desire to go hunting. He headed to the department head's office. There was no answer, and it turned out that the door was completely open. A moment later, the guy saw a terrible picture. Davis sat on the floor, doubled over in pain. Carl immediately rushed to help. He even began to assume that it was all because of their battle. Suddenly, he began to think up the most terrible plots. But Davis was talking about some chapter. Carl decided that he needed to call the head of the association and announce something. It's true that the guy finished his sentence by saying that it was he who beat him up. The very next day, after drinking the potion, there was time to explain. It turns out that he was asking his son to go on a blind date. Davis wanted to marry the one he loved, but he started beating him up. One could think of different things, but the truth was ambiguous. Assura did not want his son to remain a bachelor until old age. He began to interrogate her about his unrequited love. Our hero assumed that Davis had very little free time at the moment. Carl actually wanted to resolve the issue regarding the family. He needed someone who would help them when he was on missions. Davis immediately jumped up and said that he was not busy and had time to waste. He even started saying that he would find time by any means necessary. After that, Carl asked him to sit down quietly. And yet, it was necessary to talk about the Iron Guild. It turns out that there will be an announcement in the evening, but many things have already been decided. There was no turning back, but the reaction of the International Association was interesting. These people had no right to interfere because another scandal would start. Naturally, the main problem was in the Aingala Guild. These guys supported the Iron Guild in everything, even in the institution. The conversation between leaders who were at odds with each other was interesting. There was definitely some conflict between these two guys. Suddenly, Davis asked Carl if he would take revenge. It was indeed a fortunate moment, but he could not give advice either. They had a lot of risks. Only after putting all the factors together did Carl decide that everything was planned. They are hunting him, which means a clash is inevitable. There were 3 months left and Carl was going to eliminate all risks one after another. The whole society was soon excited by the news of the new branch. Still, some were against foreigners coming. At this time, Carl and Joseph arrived at a strange meeting place. This is a city destroyed after the gates were torn apart. Joseph assured that the address was accurate and all that was left was to wait. There was a scraping sound behind him, which meant that the guest had finally arrived. The guy with glasses landed and apologized for being late. Our hero wanted to contact the paparazzi player. Despite the warnings, it was a good union. Carl was surprised that only a middleman came on behalf of the paparazzi. The guy assured that Michael would communicate only through him. Carl insisted on a personal meeting because the matter was serious. The guy stood his ground. He had the right to accept or reject them. Joseph suddenly started talking about the dangers of a leak, and yet Carl decided to name the amount. The first installment of 5 billion. Carl promised another 10 billion for the extracted information. Information about the Angela and Iron Guilds was needed. Upon learning of the conditions, the guy immediately tensed up, calling them crazy. He refused, rejecting any reward because life was more valuable. Soon he began to leave, assuring that he had not heard anything. But our hero wasn't going to let him go that easily. He came of his own free will, but he couldn't leave like that. Our hero, with a crazy look, ordered to get down and stop pretending. The guy continued to be perplexed and asked what was going on. A moment later, Carl lowered him to the ground. He didn't have the most pleasant feelings about the paparazzi, so he wanted to resolve everything in a good way while he was still kind. The guy jumped back, continuing to play Michael's representative. But our hero was even more confident of this. Carl had one secret, because with his own eye he had the names of the rankers. The day before, the system notified Lou of his awakening. The guy immediately asked Ego what had changed. Lou explained that his demonic eye now has new skills. He could see everything that belonged to the demonic world. Our hero had no idea that he had the left eye of a demon, and yet it was most likely Ava who gave him this power. In short, this eye saw the essence, although not all the power was revealed. There was also a lot that could be invested into improving this skill. First, they decided to test the gloves. It was just now that he decided to bind the enemy with black magic. Joseph was shocked by the guy's new skill. And yet, Carl repeated his words, trying to call Michael. The boy immediately recognized the demonic eye and the meeting with the Demon King. Suddenly there was an explosion and Carl's tentacles flew apart. The real Michael emerged from the smoke, deciding that this was all interesting. Our hero was glad to achieve his goal. However, they soon decided to change the terms. There wasn't enough money, and Michael didn't want to put his life in danger. It turned out that he wanted to know more about the power of the demonic eye. He was also interested in meeting the Demon King. Carl agreed, but Michael decided that the guy did not understand the value of information. Carl immediately said that he was a disciple of the Demon King and could see the essence of people. Michael got up from his chair and accepted the payment, just like he did with the task. Having started, they will evaporate. He promised to contact as soon as there will be information. A moment later, he simply disappeared. This was the fastest agreement, which means it's time to move on. He came to the head of the association and told about his plan. The man could only close his eyes and give the green light. But Carl had one more request. He asked to evacuate people located near the branch. Assura immediately realized that Carl was going to destroy the entire branch. However, it was not easy to organize such control, even for them. Suddenly, he made a suggestion about the gate breaking. This meant that he could cause this break himself. But Assura has never been able to do this, just like any other person. And yet Carl stated that he could do something similar. Soon our hero summed up the day's results in the evening, and it was quite productive. But he still didn't have enough strength. even though he knew how to control the gate. The enemy was a very strong guild, so there was no way he could cope alone. The association could not help in the battle, but a companion was needed. This meant that he needed strength to fight against a lot of enemies. Naturally, the guy came to Gary's office, who took all the work upon himself. Soon our hero told about everything, although it was not positive. Gary immediately said that his guild was indebted to Carl. This meant that he would like to satisfy any request. The risk was great, but he came for the deal, not for a request for help. It made sense that with Thomas gone, there would be benefits for Kane. This was all clear, but our hero had one condition. He could fulfill any request his guild asked, no matter what it was. Gary was very pleased to see the growth of the previously trembling goblin boy. He agreed, but wanted to know more about their task. Gary soon stood up, saying that this needed to be resolved with the guild. Nevertheless, he promised to consider this proposal. Soon there were only 53 days left until the opening day. The guys were waiting for Carl, but for some reason he was late. The man, perplexed, said that only an hour had passed since he entered. And what's more, the gate was B rank. It's impossible to do it that fast. A moment later, our hero, covered in blood, emerged from the gate. The man was shocked, because it took the entire guild several days. Carl hoarded crystals to feed his ego. And yet, stretching, he asked where the next gate was. Suddenly, Joseph announced that they had none left. He cleared out all the gates in the area and there was nothing else to go to. Our hero was surprised and didn't even know what to do. After thinking about it, he decided to go home and take a shower. In the evening, our heroes decided to chat over a can of beer. For 2 months, Carl was going to sit in the tower and collect crystals. And I still had to hone all my skills. Joseph assured Ranker Carl that he would succeed. Suddenly, he asked if that man had appeared. Michael could appear anywhere and any time. He waved his hand and pointed back, saying that he would appear shortly. As luck would have it, the paparazzi actually teleported. The guys were already on friendly terms at that point, so Carl was drinking beer. Michael felt that Carl was different from the other rankers. One way or another, it was time to find out what the paparazzi had managed to find out. Michael managed to find out that the leg of the iron shield was cut off. Still, more valuable information was needed. He had one, but he decided to warn about something. Michael told this as the last one and left the case. Most likely, this information was the most reliable. It turned out that Lee was wounded while clearing the turret. It actually turned out to be quite critical. As a result, Lee needs the elixir. Our hero understood that we were talking about the panacea that was in the labyrinth. The information about Ava and him hadn't leaked, and that meant one thing. Thomas was going to pull off the deal using an elixir he didn't have. Our hero suddenly assumed that even here Ava was involved. Ellie suddenly assumed that Lee had seriously injured his vessel. Carl had experienced this before when he drank the elixir. Suddenly, Brunheart interrupted their conversation. The guy, perplexed, said that he had eaten too much. Lou scoffed, saying that greed was to blame. And yet, Carl decided to leave it for later. It was time to do something else. After raising Ego B, he used fusion. Having named the second ego, the merging began immediately. At this time, the action moves to the international airport. The day of the founding of the Iron Guild branch has arrived. A crazy and huge guild followed Rogers. Reporters started taking pictures of them and asking tons of questions. But they weren't so friendly, considering them strangers. Rogers thought he was better than everyone there. Suddenly, a girl approached him, asking him to take care of their country. Only he looked at her with disgust. A moment later, the association's president took her into his arms. The man beamed as he greeted the sullen guests. Rogers realized that even he could not treat him impolitely, and still he began to mumble something incomprehensible. And the man assumed that he had no idea about the powers of his interlocutor. He was surprised that a little girl could cause them problems. Grabbing the wreath, he thanked them through gritted teeth, extended his hand and saw them off, saying that they would be taken where they needed to go. The guy was supposed to go to the association, but when he got into the car, he destroyed the wreath. The guy told me to go straight to the branch. He decided that he would not listen to them in everything, and the inspection was more important. Rogers searched for information about Carl, but access to it was limited. And yet, he realized that he was connected to the Demon King, and all this was understandable. But getting information about his family was not a problem for him. He was going to kill them and see the look on Carl's face when he realized. They arrived soon after, but Rogers didn't like something. The previously bustling area was too quiet. A moment later, the siren began to scream, indicating that the gates were being torn apart. Joseph soon reported the evacuation and cordoning off of the area. It was also the last call, so he wished the guys good luck. A moment later, he activated the silencing barrier. Now our hero didn't have to worry about witnesses. This meant it was time to begin, so the gates opened instantly. A moment later, a huge army of the dead began to walk out from there. And soon Lich and Dullahan appeared and greeted the owner. Our hero's plan was simply, especially for the dead. Raising his hand, he explained that everyone with a red armband was an allied. Of course, the rest were enemies who could not be spared. Now all that remained was to get into place and act according to plan. Gary was shocked that Carl was able to cause a breakup. And looking at the monsters, one could compare them to rankers. Mason, Zane, and the others were of the same opinion as Gary. But how did they get in touch? It all happened a month ago. The Child Guild and the Morning Star Guild came to council with Carl. They both said they wanted to join him. Our hero was surprised and asked what the point was. It turns out that they started communicating after the raid. It was a long road to becoming leaders for the guys. And yet, they wanted to unite to help Carl. Of course, it was a question of benefit not only for them, but for him as well. Carl was happy about the grades, but he wasn't a member of the guild. But Mason said he saw him wearing the mask on the news. Our hero was shocked that his face was perfectly recognized. In general, they considered him great, thinking about cooperation. Our hero accepted their offer, but was the first to make a request. He appointed a place and time for all the guilds to meet for battle. He did not give details, but said that he was fighting a powerful enemy. Carl understood that it was difficult, but then he would immediately enter into an alliance with them. Mason considered it something heavy, where they could be carried away by the current. But the same Zane was confident in Carl, especially after seeing the opening of the gate. The two of them believed that player Carl would lead the way to the highest level. Our hero got out all his egos, which were already tired of waiting for battles. A moment later, a huge magical beast came out from behind, calling out to B. Carl was now absolutely sure that it was time to begin their revenge. At this time, Assura was standing on the tower, as well as Davis, who lit a cigarette. They looked in shock at the entire army of the dead, realizing the beginning of the plan. Suddenly, the head of the association asked his son if he was confident in his abilities. He clarified that he was talking about the guy, hoping that he would not become a monster. Davis replied that he hadn't even thought about it and wanted him to be happy. But Assura stated that if anything happened, he would personally intervene. Joseph's voice came from behind them, declaring that everything was ready. Now the task was to not let a single person through to them. In the name of Gregory, they were obliged to do this. At this time, Gary was running, like everyone else, to the branch. Only he clearly felt a terrible aura. She didn't look like a normal player. These were all Gregory's, they were Director Davis's soldiers. Their history was unknown, but they were created to protect all mankind. Suddenly, those same guild members appeared in front of them. These guys looked crazy and definitely had no idea what was going on. A surprise attack would be much more effective than a frontal attack. Gary landed next to the guys and began introducing himself. But the madman didn't say a word and went on the attack. Gary had to step back and freeze everything in front of him. The madman decided that Korean players weren't so bad. Soon he destroyed the ice wall with one swing. They didn't care about anything, and Rogers told them to kill anyone who got in their way. So the guy was going to fight and have fun. Gary immediately realized that this was the leader of the second group of troops. At this time, our hero was on the roof of a building. Brunheart was proud of his work, his army. But now it was time for the real battle to begin. But what was the structure of the branch? Of course, the head is Rogers. Next came the leader of the first team, Chelmont. Then there was that madman, Rhodes. The final link was the leader of the third team, Carlin. Carl's role was to prevent these teams from uniting. Using the skill, Elemental Water, the monster turned into water and began to swim down. It was quite convenient for the main character to move around. They were superior in terms of armed forces, but it was too early to decide victory in advance. They could fall into a trap at any moment. Meanwhile, Zane and the guild encountered Chelmont. The man was puzzled that Korea was greeting them so pitifully. The guys, in turn, were perplexed by their meeting with this big guy. People continued to fight, but even with the guild members, it was hard. Mason was hoping for quick help from player Carl. Chelmont was truly merciless. His attacks were powerful. Suddenly, one of the guys just activated the earth shield. This could only help him for a couple of seconds because soon the wall was blown up. Marvin was defeated, causing Zane to scream in confusion. Chelmont warmed up by saying that they were all weaklings. The leader of the first team ordered to bring at least a ranker. At that very moment, our hero turned to him, saying that he was already here. The giant didn't even have time to say anything and received a powerful blow to the head. Within a few seconds, his body was consumed. All the participants in the battle turned their heads in horror. They could see Chelmont turning into fragments. Our hero was not happy about the failure of the transformation. And yet, that was not the most important thing now. Approaching his guys, he asked if everything was okay. Marvin coughed, saying that he was a little late, but everyone was alive. Suddenly, our hero opened the gate and took out a potion from there. Marvin was shocked by what he saw. At this time, the members of the Chelmont team could not believe his death. But this was not the end of the nightmare, because it was just beginning. The huge beast swallowed one of the enemies in the blink of an eye. Mason was ready to attack, but wondered if it was an enemy. Turning around, he saw Carl winking. This meant that the wolf was their ally, and it was time to retreat. The wolf began to engage in battle alone against a small army. All the mages concentrated their attack on the monster. Suddenly, there was a huge splash of water, and the wolf disappeared. The boys started to spin around, assuming that the wolf was dead. In just a moment, he was behind them, even more aggressive. The guys could have come to the rescue, but Mason decided not to interfere. He understood that they could suffer from the wolf, but that was not all he thought. Noticing that Chelmont's body had disappeared, he remembered that very raid. And yet, at that moment, our hero continued to push forward. The wolf continued to destroy all enemies. Mason looked at all this chaos in silence and soon realized one thing. The man decided to pretend that he had not seen or heard anything at all. At this time, the army of the dead was advancing. Rogers was incredibly pleased when he destroyed them. He understood that they were closing the gap, which is why he didn't pay attention to it. At this time, the lich was hovering in the air and watching the people. He understood that he had to tie up this whole crowd. But Rogers certainly scared him, even the king of the dead. But still, in an instant, he created a whole army of magic arrows. They all went to Earth, but Rogers decided that things would not be so simple. Swinging his blade, he created a temporary barrier, protecting himself. The power of Nyan was never to be underestimated. Turning around, Rogers told Carlin to go to the other team. The girl thought that it was not necessary, but there was only one answer. Rogers felt that the dead were not behaving like ordinary people. That's why he had a bad feeling. Suddenly, the guild noticed a strange green glow in the sky. They understood that it was something sinister and powerful. Suddenly, Ego was told that this was indeed an infuriating aura. Ellie confirmed that the source was the sacred sword. Suddenly, Brunheart declared that all the skeletons had been destroyed. Everything happened much faster, which meant it was time to move on. Carl climbed up and asked to heal each other and join him. Carl himself immediately sent into battle. At this time, there was a meeting of the guilds, where there was clearly resentment. The Hephaestus Guild has been kicked out of their area where the rift occurred. Jax wasn't going to just keep quiet and turn a blind eye to the association. Even Chung said that the association had never done this. They all decided that this was a strange situation. But what was even more interesting was that Gary was missing. Dennis still wanted to hear what the leader of the 10 Guild Union would say. Of course, the leader was Lee, who clearly knew something. While on the road, Carl was very worried about Hart and Dullahan. No matter how many crystals they absorbed, it was difficult to cope. Right now, Kane's guild was fighting both teams, but the time set according to the conditions was only 2 hours. Davis could afford to put up a barrier, but it was very expensive. So it fell on Carl's shoulders that the plan had to be carried out quickly. At this time, Assura announced that he would open the barrier in an hour. Davis screamed in confusion, asking what was going on. He was shocked, because they had not agreed on this. But still, this was the most he could give. Davis continued to scream for a long time, but suddenly something shut him up. Assura stated that Lee was approaching. They were supposed to call Gregory and be ready for an imminent battle. At this time, a nightmare was happening on the battlefield. Peter could have died because of just one mistake. Luckily for him, someone came to his aid. The guild deputy saved the guy. And soon he expressed dissatisfaction that it was becoming increasingly difficult. It was difficult for them, but it was still much more difficult for the guild leader. It turns out that Gary fought alone against 2 leaders. They couldn't decide who would kill Gary, so they fought together. Gary understood that although they were crazy, they acted in a coordinated manner. This meant that it was time to retreat, so he used the skill and left. The first thing to do was to kill Carlin. Her main problem was speed and reflexes. He couldn't fight her, because the problem lay in Rhodes too. The guy was stupid and was frozen again. The girl began to get annoyed by this, and every time she saved him. With a deft movement, she chopped off his limbs. The guy grew his arms and legs back in an instant through regeneration. It was worth thinking through a whole plan to destroy them. It was worth at least separating these two and then acting. Suddenly, a strange noise began to spread throughout the entire area. Carlin noticed this and announced the approaching danger. Literally a moment later, a guy who had rushed past jumped out at them. The girl didn't even have time to blink and realize what it was. At this point, Hermes could already go beyond his capabilities. And yet the strain on the body was great. Carlin didn't know that there was anyone in Korea with such movement skills. At this point, Rhodes began to scream in bewilderment. His whole body was covered in scratches and abrasions. His blood gushed in all directions, and his agony spread to all sides. Rhodes was a little surprised, but such nonsense did not affect him. However, suddenly our hero turned to him and named his skill. Carl still didn't know English well, but he tried to speak it. With great difficulty, he concluded that his regeneration no longer worked. It was all thanks to B's ego skills. Gary was glad that everything was going according to plan, and Carl finally arrived. At this time, Carlin tried to understand what was happening because it was impossible. And yet, Rhodes realized that he too had special skills. The guy said that he hadn't been in so much pain for a long time. He saw Carl's superiority, but he was lagging behind him. The guy suddenly shouted, saying that he had an ace hidden away. A moment later, the guy went into berserker mode. A huge mountain of muscle was about to attack our hero. Without blinking an eye, Rhodes was already in front of Carl's face. With a wave of his hand, he decided to even the odds. A huge wall of dust hung right in the middle of the city during the rain. Carlin immediately decided that this battle was over. Berserk was a skill that granted the owner divine power. She couldn't believe Rhodes was using this skill. And yet, behind her, Gary's voice came, reminding her of himself. Soon, he broke the ice wall and stood in front of her. He immediately went on the attack. A bunch of ice projectiles flew towards her, and she dodged them as best she could. Still, she dodged all the projectiles too easily. In a moment, she was behind him and about to end it all. Only Gary suddenly started laughing. He decided that she didn't know him well. Instantly, the guy used the absolute zero skill and stopped everything. Gary admitted that he gave in to the last resort and saved his strength. Carlin laughed and said that his partner had already become a cutlet. However, our hero was more than alive and was sitting on Rhodes. The girl was in incredible shock, yet Gary decided to continue their fight. The guy smiled and suggested that she try to block it. A moment later, a huge iceberg was visible in the sky. Carlin was now inside the ice structure. Turning his head, the guy realized that Carl was not finished yet. It wasn't that easy to pull out the blades, which is why he simply got stuck. Suddenly, the giant simply pierced himself through and pushed the enemy back. Rhodes believed that there was no one more interesting in this country than Lee. And yet, he learned that there was a demon king and 2 other good players. Suddenly, he decided it was time to try fighting at full power. But their fight was interrupted by the cry of Joseph. He stated that Ranker Lee was already on his way. At this time, a guy stood in front of the barrier, addressing the leader. Lee and the other leaders were confused and asked what was going on inside. But Rhodes was disappointed that his fight was being interrupted again. The giant moved towards Joseph to chop him into pieces. But our hero did not allow this to happen, shackle him just like Michael. Then he advised the secretary to leave here quickly. But Joseph understood that there was no point in retreating. The guy turned around and decided to join the fight. At this moment, Rhodes emerged from captivity. Literally without even waiting for his opponent to take action, the giant went into battle. Swinging his blade, he joyfully declared that their battle was beginning. But our hero was not at the scene of the impact. Carl was behind him, saying that he just didn't have time for him. Our hero decided that he needed to finish as soon as possible. Soon he used elemental darkness. Lee noticed Gregory's employees at this time. Looking at them, he decided that they intended to start a fight with them. The man exclaimed in surprise, saying that it was a misunderstanding. The association asked for assistance, although it seemed like a demand. Lee stated that it was unreasonable for the guild leader Hephaestus to do this. They came to block the gap unless they had a reason to refuse. And yet he supposed that there was something inside that they weren't supposed to know. Assura stated that this was unfounded, since they wanted to avoid damage. They also did not want to interfere with those already fighting with useless reinforcements. Lee being called useless was incredibly offensive to him. Suddenly there was silence, and Lee's voice was heard again. He said they could break through by force. Only Assura declared that he would fight them. The chairman reacted instantly and took out the legendary weapon. The heads of the guilds knew about this weapon, and yet Lee suddenly offered them something. The guy suggested going inside alone without anyone else. Lee mentally turned to Mr. Assura. The guy said that he would not tell anyone what was going on and would even be on their side. At this time, our hero turned his body into darkness with his skill. Rhodes, looking at this, even became a little scared. And yet, using the connection, the guy reached out to the enemy. He was sure it wouldn't work on him, but a moment later his face changed because he couldn't choose. It seemed that the skill only changed external indicators. In fact, it strengthened magical powers of similar significance. Carl continued to pull the enemy towards him. Within a couple of seconds, the blade touched Rhodes's head. A second later, his sword fell to the ground. Our hero absorbed it too, and the transformation was successful. A moment later, he came back to normal. This skill was accumulated for the most extreme cases due to the workload. Turning his head, it turned out that Kane had also dealt with all the enemies. This meant that it was time to move on to the final stage. Already on the way, Carl asked Brunheart about the condition of his companions. Surprisingly, Lich and Dullahan were still alive. In just a moment, our hero arrived at the scene of the battle. Carl immediately greeted Rogers happily. The guy had been waiting for this meeting as long as this madman had. At that very moment, he began to accumulate enormous power in the blade. The monsters were shocked that they did not fight with all their might. And yet, the long-awaited skirmish soon began. Only then Rogers suddenly remembered the words of the guild leader. Thomas advised to be careful because Carl could absorb the power of swords. This caused Rogers to retreat. With this, Carl also realized that the Iron Guild knew about everything. Turning around, the boy thanked Hart and Dullahan. A moment later, he sent them to the gate to be restored. Now only the two of them remained on the battlefield. But Rogers didn't fully understand what this terrible force was. He didn't know how Carl became so strong in such a short time. Soon the guy smiled and suggested playing tag. By this time, Gary and Joseph had arrived to watch the show. They hadn't seen each other for a while, and Carl had become so strong. Our hero had a clear advantage in both technique and strength. Rogers had a hard time dodging the primitive attacks, and soon our hero wounded him in the leg. Lou suggested finishing with this weakling as soon as possible. Our hero agreed with this, which is why he raised his blade. Soon the blade was flying towards Rogers. The boy realized it was too late to dodge. The action takes us to the main office of the Iron Guild. Thomas lit a cigarette, assuming that his men had already arrived in Korea. The assistant hoped that everything would be fine, because they had the sacred sword. The guy said he was sure, and that he had warned Rogers. However, this was not particularly important. It turns out that the sword was not just a sacred one, it had one surprise. Somehow the boy managed to survive the attack. Our hero did not understand what had happened because he had absorbed something. Lou suddenly stated that something seemed strange to him. Ellie told the owner that it was a fallen sacred sword. This weapon now looked more like a demonic blade. Because of this, Rogers became infected, becoming even more insane. A moment later, he ran into battle with the desire to destroy Carl. The guy swung his blade, but our hero calmly dodged it. Joseph wanted to join the fight, but Gary stopped him. The guy felt that something was wrong, and yet the battle continued. Our hero calmly hit Rogers and sent him flying. This only meant that he was becoming even weaker. Ellie explained that it was all because of the sword. The blade originally gave power to whoever used it. But eventually, something terrible happens. The blade began to take away all strength and absorb the owner from the inside. Thomas and the assistant discussed all this. The man decided that this was a dangerous way to stay in Korea. But there was no need to worry. Nain was a safe sword. This blade was to gradually become the foundation for revenge. Everything was supposed to take about 6 months, and there shouldn't have been any problems. The man was sure that in Korea, no one would be able to wield the full power of the sword. At this time, Rogers was lying on the ground, shaking in pain. He attacked with all his might, trying to find out what had happened to him. Our hero didn't even move from his place, he just made a swing. This swing was enough to cut off the attacker's hand. Now Rogers looked even more pathetic than ever. He crawled towards his sword, hoping to gain power. All egos supported the option of killing Rogers and taking final revenge. And yet Carl came up with something. Opening the potion, he poured it onto his enemy's hand. The guy started laughing, realizing that they all knew they weren't to be messed with. He continued to threaten Carl and the others, but was again silenced. The guy advised him to open the status window. He immediately went to study the characteristics. Horror awaited him in the system because he rolled back to the very bottom and became level 1. The guy started screaming in pain and humiliation. Being level 1 meant being worse than a bug. Hearing all this, Carl simply couldn't hold back and punched him in the face. He began to beat the ungrateful degenerate. Of course, everything, because he was also first level. Gary and Joseph saw it exactly the same way. Nothing to say. A moment later, a familiar sound was heard. Joseph stated that the barrier was open right now. It only meant that Lee was coming here. Our hero stopped and said that Rogers was lucky today. Nevertheless, he sent him to the gate and ordered him to be saved. Carl also threw a pitiful sacred sword inside the gate. Soon, Ego notified the owner of the problem. Turning their heads, they felt a huge magical power. Naturally, its source was the head of the guilds. Now he didn't even want to perceive it as a simple gate rupture. Looking at Carl, he greeted him. He was very glad that he was on the list of their guild. And yet he asked to explain what was going on here. Joseph suddenly started shouting and introducing himself as an employee of the association. He stated that all members of the Iron Guild died when the gate was closed. Lee laughed and said he knew it was all their doing. And yet the Iron Guild promised him a meeting with someone who had the necessary thing. Suddenly, he asked the Demon King to show his true appearance. Our heroes didn't understand what kind of nonsense this was. Just at that moment, a gap appeared, from which someone began to emerge. It was Joshua and Ava who imagined meeting the student differently. The boys were perplexed by the sight of the Demon King. Our hero himself was surprised that he did not feel her presence. The girl was upset that the reaction was poor because she wanted a surprise. Still, she wanted to talk about this later. The guy said he needed a panacea elixir. The girl felt that he was dirty, and yet they were not on good terms for her to help him. The guy decided to offer her a deal, but she was harshly refused. She didn't want to use this thing on him because it wouldn't save him completely. Lee decided that there was no other way out, so he was going to fight. It only became clear when I saw the guild leader's snow-white sword. Ego also stated that it was a sacred sword. Ava came up close and said that he couldn't handle her. She assured him that everything would turn into a sea of fire, and he didn't like to kill. She knew Lee wasn't the type to tolerate chaos, and yet she teleported to the assistant. Joshua got the panacea elixir in the blink of an eye. The girl asked what the conditions were at Lee. The guy promised to save everyone who was here, including her successor. Ava saw it more as a threat and him as a bandit. Throwing the elixir into Lee's hands, she told him not to touch Carl for a whole year. The boy grabbed the elixir and accepted the promise. Lee started to leave, but the girl stopped him. She told him to swear by his divine name. But the truth is, a moment later, he simply teleported away. Joseph soon collapsed, saying he couldn't even breathe from the pressure. Ava suddenly asked the boys to leave and she would go with the student. Our hero didn't even have time to say anything and was teleported. In his sleep, he heard something, but did not understand. Ego began to awaken its owner. Suddenly, the guy jumped up from his seat. Looking around, he immediately realized that this was his home. He was surprised that she knew where his house was. Suddenly, the guy asked about the demon's eye. Ava stated that she had been watching through that eye the entire time. She was touched when she saw the shy Carl. However, the guy wanted to know what they were doing here, and yet he owed them a debt. The guy wanted to know who she was. Ava promised to tell about everything, but only gradually. First of all, they had a conversation on another topic. He didn't understand what could be more important than the elixir, the demon's eye, and so on. The girl suddenly, with a sweet face, began asking to be sheltered in her home. Our hero instantly froze, not understanding what he had just heard. The girl did not skimp on compliments for Carl's mother. They were certainly able to find a common language. Ava even managed to get in touch with Mary, giving her compliments. The girls began to whisper among themselves. Our hero, in turn, had no idea how this happened. Both his mother and sister asked him to tell them where he met such a beauty. The guy wanted to escape from here. He knew he couldn't satisfy their imagination after TV series. Now I had to know what to come up with. If he talks nonsense, they will question him even more. He started doing whole mathematical analyses in his head. Suddenly, the guy jumped up and shouted something about a dog. A moment later, he said that he was given a dog and he ran away. The guy was undoubtedly in a desperate situation. He began to ask the ego to accept the small size. Thanks to the pitiful appearance of the owner, the egos obeyed him. The cutest little dog appeared on Earth. The girls started to squeeze him and be surprised at how cute he was. The guy said he didn't paint the dog and that he named him B. Mary was incredibly happy and said that for the first time her brother was cool. Ava smiled and told the student that he was smart. However, she said that she would like to rest today. But since Carl was trying, she decided to talk to him a little. In front of the cafe, the guy was giving cleaning instructions. Carl was not happy that he had caused the destruction and that others had to clean up after him. And yet he soon returned to his friends. Ava reassured him, saying that he was of little use with a broom. The next question of interest was their safety. The girl said that the Joshua barrier is incredible. Right now, not only have they not been heard, they haven't even been seen. And yet, the time had come for questions to be answered and it was time to begin. Our hero actually wanted to ask about many things, but ever since their meeting he had been experiencing constant discomfort. Looking at Joshua, he asked if he was really a player. Suddenly, he asked again, at least clarifying about the person. Ava smiled and said that the beginning was unexpected, but he had good instincts. But she directed him with this question to her sword. Lou suddenly said that he didn't remember everything well, but in fact Joshua is a demon. Moreover, he is one of the most cruel and great demons. Suddenly, Joshua knelt down and greeted the great king of all demons. Ava started laughing loudly, saying that it was all funny. Looking at the ring, she guessed that his name was now Lou. The guy jumped up in bewilderment, asking if she could hear the voice of the ego. She heard them, and also the voice of Ellie and the baby driven into her heart. But there was nothing strange about it because he also shared a review. The girl, having read his thoughts, said that everything was correct. The guy now decided that she was reading his thoughts, but that was not the case. She could hear what he wanted to convey to her, but no one else could eavesdrop. Our hero sighed heavily, realizing that it was difficult for him to take everything in at once. Ava called the student a little stupid, but decided to tell everything. She immediately stated that Joshua had shown respect far from Lou. The man addressed Carl directly. Soon, even Lou claimed that Joshua was the one who betrayed him. Ava nodded her head, saying that was true. Joshua was the founder of the rebellion and Lou's imprisonment. Lou really disliked this guy. And yet, Ava decided to return to the present. It was high time to talk about the demon's eye. She assumed that Lou didn't know everything because of his recent reincarnation. Still, she wanted to know how he managed to revive this eye. The problem was that this was the main sign of the demon. Our hero immediately assumed that it was not Ava who gave him the eye. Lou, perplexed, reminded that people can't just get it. In that case, he wondered if it was possible to accept such power. Ava actually had no idea that he would show any ability. Lou assumed that he was a descendant of Eamon. At that very moment, our hero began to think about his father. Suddenly, the girl said that demon eye is a standard skill. However, all demons had different ones. For example, like his, purple ones were some of the rarest. The level of the demon depended on the color. Green, the lowest, red, the middle. Purple was the color for royal demons. There simply were no higher demons in nature. The girl suddenly declared that she could use any demon eye. She interrupted the puzzled Lou and said that she had a different situation. It meant something unclear. Carl wanted to know if she was really human. The girl assured that she was a special case, and he was also like her. Suddenly, she started lifting her t-shirt. This really scared the guy and he started to turn away. Only Lou asked the owner to calm down and take a look. He suddenly saw a stone in the shape of a cat's head. This meant that a demon was transplanted into her. This is another face of Joshua, so she is half human, half demon. The cat had the same predatory power as Lou. Ava didn't fully believe in him, but he more than lived up to her expectations. She hoped that she could fulfill her dream of killing the real Demon King. There was grief over the death of the Korean branch of the Iron Guild. There was no leak of information, but the public was shocked. Only Lee tried to calm the press because he was the #1 player. But Thomas was too calm and only expressed grief for the dead. Both the American and Korean media were reassured by this reaction. And yet, despite the fact that they suffered minor damage, there were casualties. Our hero returned home with a burden on his heart. They reassured the owner and said that it was not his fault. Only when he entered the house did he see Ava sitting on his bed. The girl was glad to see that the student had returned home. Without chewing Ava, she began to say something incomprehensible. She said she had nowhere to sleep, so she was here. Soon he asked where his relatives were, and it turned out that they had gone to a restaurant. The guy was undressing and listening to what Ava was saying. Suddenly she went silent. Confused, he came down, asking if she was following him. The guy didn't understand how to go to the toilet. Ava immediately assured that she was not always watching him. She only watched when assigned. And yet he wanted to get rid of this stupid surveillance. The girl sighed, assuming that he would be bored. And yet she went to Carl, saying that the same ritual was needed. Her influence was strong in his body, so he had to try. Suddenly, the girl pulled herself towards him and kissed him on the lips. The guy stepped back in bewilderment and asked what it was. The girl laughed, assuming that this was the first kiss. Our hero turned his head away in embarrassment. She just made sure that she was right, although she was surprised. In any case, everything is done and soon his pupils will return to normal. She was even upset that she could no longer hear the voices of the ego. Soon she suggested going together. The path led them to the basement because Joshua had prepared something for them. In a moment, they found themselves in a huge space. Carl didn't even believe that this was his basement, and yet now it was the perfect place to train. The guy asked in confusion what this meant. The girl smiled and asked what reasons there were for a duel between a teacher and a student. Ava took a stance and ordered her student to attack her. Unfortunately, she couldn't teach him much like the 50th floor. On this floor, there was a change of class, and this floor is special for everyone. All unique skills will be strengthened on it, or it will even receive a second one. But still, she didn't mean that she couldn't teach him anything at all. She suggested that the student simply try to attack her. At that very moment, our hero ran towards her. However, on the field, she simply disappeared. In a moment, the blade was at Carl's neck, meaning defeat. The girl was too fast and adjusted to his thoughts. Ava's fighting skills were beyond the pale. She assumed that the student already understood her technique and experience. In that case, she was not going to wait any longer. A moment later, she was behind Carl again. Our hero miraculously managed to dodge. But then came dozens of powerful attacks. They held the balance of power, but it was upset by the Iron Guild. She said straight out that Carl had to become stronger. He had a year to become stronger than Thomas. Of course, another case is death. At that very second, she used a unique skill and went on the attack. Our hero also went on the offensive. There was a huge explosion, which Joshua decided to dodge. Soon the guy was on the ground and breathing heavily. Ava laughed, saying that the battle was pretty tough. She also reminded him that they were the same age, so he could call her by her first name. Carl asked in surprise why she said this at that particular moment. The action moves inside the gate, where Rogers has become a worker. The lich descended upon him like a god and threw moldy bread as food for the day. Rogers was incredibly happy about this and immediately stuffed himself with it. The lich was surprised that a man who deserved a painful death wanted to live. He decided to remind that all this was possible only thanks to the master. Yet soon he struck him with a whip and sent him to work again. The guy fell to the ground and began to rake everything under him. His eyes were filled with rage towards the iron shield. The resort center worked, because the anger was directed in another direction. By the way, Rogers was supposed to be building one structure at the moment. Even in this, Lich found some deep meaning from the master. Our hero saw that little by little everything was working out, but in reality, he just wanted the guy to suffer. Soon Carl asked Joshua if everything was going as it should. The demon on the ground printed out an incomprehensible symbol. In the world, the entity asked to enter the gates of Carl and explore them. Ava, in turn, assured that Joshua knows a lot and will be useful. So said the Demon King, but Joshua still seemed unpleasant. And yet, soon the seal began to glow even brighter, which meant that everything was ready. Joshua stated that his gate was using a lot of power. In other words, it was overheating. To do this, he collected the remains of magical power and created crystals. The guy didn't understand why they needed to return the crystals. They could do that and improve the efficiency that way. Only Joshua stated that his goal was different. These crystals were not ordinary but transparent. The crystal itself was the material and fuel, and depending on the strength, the colors changed. This crystal was special, but Carl didn't know where to use it. It seemed that he was completely empty and without magical power. It was, of course, logical to sell these crystals. But Joshua assured that once its value was known, even $1 billion would not be enough. At this time, the truth behind these crystals has not been clarified. The demon stated that he would definitely find out everything soon. This guy wasn't friendly, more like a friend of my friend. But the experiment was a success, and so he looked kinder than usual. For example, it became clear that the gate is a kingdom. But if it is a kingdom, it means that someone rules it. The man said that it might be so and it might not. Our hero asked a lot of questions trying to figure out the essence of the tower and the gate. Only Joshua decided that their conversation had dragged on too long. He added that there was an opportunity to answer his questions. Carl must climb up the tower, and on the 50th floor he will receive new rights. Returning back from the gates, Ava and Carl continued training. Suddenly she asked how long he would run away from a girl like her. The guy laughed and said that with the Demon King, the only option was to escape. The girl made a dash towards him. She realized that he had just blown her off. Their training was aggressive and technical, but Carl was always destroyed by surprise. You can't use force alone because he will still fall. Only after hearing the word Iron Shield did the guy get a second wind. The assimilation level increased, as did Carl's strength. At that very moment, something incredible began to happen. The girl admired her student, and our hero was shocked. The closer he was to Lou, the stronger the death control skill became. Carl's eyes were filled with mad evil again. Ava knew the training was going too far. Because of this, she decided to bring him down to earth. The guy was lying on the ground and didn't even understand what had just happened. Ava, As soon as she landed, decided to admit that he was not bad. Only she also added that her student almost went crazy. She wanted to know how he felt when the darkness almost swallowed him. The guy said in surprise that it sounded funny. And yet he felt himself above all people. Ava concluded that this is the magic that demons depend on. Suddenly, the girl ordered to find a man who had 100 swords. Our hero, of course, had no idea who we were talking about. It turns out that this player owned the sword Kaleon and the sword Nain, as well as many others. She was sure that she needed to find the sacred sword and strengthen her powers. He had to learn to control himself because his strength was backfiring. Anyway, soon she suggested going out for a bite to eat because she was hungry. She hoped that Lily and Mary were already home. Our hero also didn't know where his relatives were, so he opened a warehouse. From there, he took out his phone to check notifications. Suddenly, Carl received a call from Jack's grandfather. It was unlike him, since he had never called him before. The subscriber was saying something, but he couldn't be heard. The guy tried to shout to Jack while Ava went to eat. Carl didn't understand why his grandfather was silent. The main thing is that the barrier remained open, which means there was a connection. Finally, he was able to utter one word. Workshop. The man asked to come to his workshop. With the last of his strength, Jack said that they simply didn't have time. Our hero, hearing the last words, was horrified. At this time, Joseph was sitting in the cafe and having lunch, when suddenly a call came. The ranker immediately asked if the player could run without permission on the street. Joseph replied that it was dangerous, and therefore it was not allowed, but what was the point? Our hero informed us that he needed to go somewhere. The man said that all he had to do was warn him in advance and that would be it. Suddenly, Carl just hung up. At this time, our hero was already running through all the districts and houses. The goal was to get to the workshop as quickly as possible. In just a few moments, they arrived. As he entered, he did not feel the presence of other people except Jack. Ego was still advised to be on guard in such an incomprehensible place. Approaching the door, the guy analyzed the room. There was no danger inside, which meant we could safely enter. At that very moment, he saw that the workshop had been looted and Jack was wounded. The guy immediately ran to him to help. Unfortunately, he found that both his hands had gone soft. Looking around, Carl noticed that all the weapons were missing. Suddenly, the man started coughing. Jack was incredibly happy to see Carl in front of him. The first thing he did was start taking out the potion, and then he was going to call an ambulance. But the man assured that he felt that he did not have long to live. Unfortunately, this was confirmed by the ego, who said that the potion would not help. The man asked for just to listen to him instead of help. He recalled that he once asked for one request. Jack stated that he was one of the pioneers they often talked about. Our hero stepped back in bewilderment. Many people knew about people who became players when the tower appeared. At the beginning, no one knew about it, and there was no information about monster hunting. He had no interest in becoming stronger, so he decided not to go higher. Every word came with difficulty, which frightened Carl very much. And yet he continued his story. Jack was a tank and wasn't involved in blacksmithing, but he tried his hand at it. He could make good weapons, but he couldn't make any special weapons. He made such equipment as soon as he had the incentive. This all happened before he went to the 50th floor to get a class. The man was trying to find a way to improve his blacksmithing skills. And suddenly a question came into his head. Has Carl ever thought about why you only have to climb up the tower? What was in the basements of the tower? Is the first floor really the first floor? It took him several years to find the dungeon. He circled the first floor over and over again, passing the same places. He was even there where no one went, and it seemed that this floor was better known. And yet, at some point, the man was able to find what he was looking for. Jack stated that he had discovered a door leading to the basement. At the same moment, a powerful charge hit Carl in the head. His brain was in tension, and Jack said that he then entered another world. The system started screaming that Carl had learned information without the right to know it. For such a terrible deed, the punishment was agony. The man was still saying something, but the guy was shouting and walking around. They tried to shout to their owner and stop his attack. He immediately remembered how Ava talked about the 50th floor. Joshua also spoke because he couldn't tell much. Apparently, these words about the right and the fine were discussed. Jack asked the guy in confusion if everything was okay. Gathering his will into a fist, Carl asked to continue the story. But the feeling was such that something was digging around in his head. But there might not have been such a chance. He had to hear everything. The dungeon turned out to be not fantastic. Burning earth, desert. Lou immediately began to have ideas. Still, it would have been worth listening to Jack first. The man wandered for a long time and found nothing. It seemed as if he was in endless space. He decided that it was worth going back along the same path. It was only when he turned his head that he was met by a monster. He was much stronger than anyone else in the tower. Among the pioneers, Jack was the strongest, but he stood there, numb, waiting for death. But suddenly she appeared. It turned out that the man was talking about his wife. Their first meeting was very bright. Carl assumed that his wife was also a gambler. The man tried to say something but soon simply fell down. Ellie began to tell her owner that his life was leaving him. With his last breath, the grandfather asked to take what was in his pocket. Inside there was a map and something else incomprehensible. Jack wanted him to go to the first floor and find the dungeon. And yet he did not want to die so easily, because his grandson would be alone. With every second his life left his body. Suddenly, Brunheart reminded him that he could turn a person into an ego. After consulting, they decided that it was worth trying. Carl stated that he had one possible way of salvation. He needed to take his life and the chances of success were slim. The man smiled and said that there was no need to even rack his brains. If Carl knew a way, he could do it for him. He suddenly said that he would not have invited him here if he did not trust him. In this case, our hero decided to act, but he had to endure it. Soon, the cannibalism skill was activated. But Jack couldn't be turned into an ego. He became a fragment. Ellie encouraged the owner, saying that they would still find a way to do something. Soon the boy asked Lou if he learned anything from the story. But the problem was that there would be punishment for this information. And for information from the old man, death was usually the penalty. Lou decided to tell initially safe information about another world. There were more than one such world, and yet he decided to continue later because it was too dangerous. The action moves to the first floor where the ceremony took place. The cult discussed opening the door for the victim. At this time, the body of a boy was inside the coffin. The apostle decided that they all did not know what would happen when the seal was removed, and yet he did not say but decided to begin the ceremony. Just a moment later, there was a loud explosion. Of course, it was Carl, who was furious and looking for the boy. Our hero left the workshop quickly. Having studied the map, he knew exactly where he needed to go. He knew the route perfectly, because at one time he had completely explored the first floor. This is where the goblins appeared. But now there was a strange and incomprehensible barrier here. Lou stated that it was designed to interfere with recognition. And yet, now it was necessary to decide how to get inside. Lou said that such barriers usually require a key. The boy instantly remembered the old man's things and decided that it was a key. Without thinking twice, our hero took it out and was able to easily go inside. Soon the same explosion happened and Carl stood among the cultists. Seeing the coffin, the guy began to feel Martin's aura inside. On the way here, he managed to find out something thanks to the guards. They were all from the Carbon Guild and their goal was terrifying. They were going to sacrifice the boy because he was the descendant of the Guardian. They wanted to open a door to another world, and Carl had already heard about them somewhere. Still, most of them were mid-rankers. But the most dangerous was the Apostle, who was felt to be almost on the same level. Our hero understood that he couldn't cope alone. In that case, he decided to summon an army of bloodthirsty dead. The leader did not understand how the man possessed such skills. He was incredibly angry, assuming that their apostle was not so strong. Still, he decided that the guy had used some strange trick. A moment later, he went on the attack. He was incredibly angry about the disrupted ceremony. But these attacks were too slow after the Demon King. The cultist continued to strike dozens of times, perplexed. Our hero continued to dodge and listen to the fanatic's delirium. Finally, the guy got tired of jumping and decided to just finish him off. A moment later, he fell to the ground, muttering something under his breath. Before his death, the leader addressed Mr. Andras. This name immediately made Lou aggressive. Our hero felt a strong anger. But most importantly, there was no such anger even on the 30th floor. Lou promised to tell later, but now it was necessary to destroy everyone. In front of our hero stood the Apostle, who did not take his eyes off him. The guy was shocked by the reaction, so he assumed he would attack first. Ellie suddenly stated that she did not feel any evil aura. The boy asked what the Apostle's purpose was and why he was standing still. The man, perplexed, replied that he didn't want to look at all this either. He couldn't bear to see his son being used. Our hero even thought about it, trying to comprehend what he had heard. He immediately realized that the Apostle was Father Martin.